Long before the world called it an empire, before the eagle banners fluttered on distant frontiers, and before senators schemed in marble halls, there was only a whisper, a soft murmur nestled in the cradle of 7 gentle hills that kissed the bend of the Tiber. The river, quiet and brown, slipped through reeds and ruins not yet built, carrying fragments of time not yet born. In the hush of dawn, when mist clung to the earth like a half-forgotten dream, a shepherd boy might pause beside his flock, feel the dew soaking into his sandals, and gaze across the rolling hills where no city yet stood. The breeze would rustle through the tall grass, and the boy, half asleep, might think he heard something stirring beneath the soil. Not wind, not water, something older, something waiting. There were stories, of course, old, strange stories passed down around fires, told in quiet voices with glances over the shoulder, that this land was sacred, that the gods had touched it, that a she-wolf once suckled twin boys, who would one day shape the fate of the world with bare hands and unbending will. The older shepherds would not say so aloud, but sometimes, when the sun was just a golden smear behind the clouds, and the cicadas fell silent, they would shiver, because even the soil seemed to remember. The stones, buried deep and uncut, seemed to hum, not loudly, just enough to make you stop and listen, as if a voice were whispering to the earth through the roots of old trees, not in words, but in memory. Before Rome was Rome, it was a place of shadows and signs, a place where myth stretched its fingers into the waking world and traced the outline of a city not yet born. The forests were thick then, tangled and dark, and wolves howled not far from the edge of firelight, but the land had already chosen something vast, something restless. The Etruscans, who came before, had sensed it too. They built their sacred groves and their solemn tombs, carved strange faces into stone, and walked with a reverence toward sky and soil. Their dead were buried with cups of wine and bronze mirrors, as if they knew the soul might need to check its reflection one last time before it wandered into the great hush. They were not Romans, not yet, but they carried something in their breath, a gravity, a yearning, a sense that the world could be shaped like clay if only one dared to press hard enough. And in this silence, this lull of beginnings, the myth began to breathe. 2 infants, left to die, floated not into oblivion, but into legend. The she-wolf, fierce and silent, found them by the riverbank. No one saw her come, no one heard her pause upon the earth, but when she curled herself around them, nursed them with a mother's tenderness, it was not simply survival, it was an offering, a vow, that these boys, Romulus and Remus, were not like others. They had the wild in their veins and destiny in their eyes. They grew under the watch of shepherds, played among the hills, fought like brothers do, and dreamed bigger than the sky. Their bond was strong, but so was the hunger in each, and as the years passed, the hills around them seemed less like playgrounds and more like thrones. The stars above no longer simply twinkled, they watched. When the boys quarreled, as boys will, it was not over games, but over fate, over where the city should rise, who should lead, who should yield. And when blood was spilled, Remus falling to Romulus's fury, the myth did not shatter, it crystallized. For Rome was not born of harmony, it was born of sacrifice, of blood and ambition, of vision and violence. Romulus, now alone, took up his brother's silence and laid the first stones of a city that would one day stretch across 3 continents. He did not weep. The gods did not intervene. And the river kept flowing, as if the death of a brother were just another ripple in its long, slow journey toward the sea. In time, huts were raised on Palatine Hill, circled by trenches and fences, fires burned through the night, and the howling of wolves gave way to the clinking of bronze. People came drawn not by comfort, but by something else. A pulse, a promise. Rome, even in its infancy, did not lure with peace. It called with power. It offered hardship, yes, but also the chance to carve your name into eternity. Outsiders, fugitives, and wanderers, they were welcomed, or at least tolerated, because Rome was not a bloodline. It was an idea, a flame you could carry if you dared to burn. And so it grew, slowly, unevenly, mud brick homes, wooden palisades, the stink of livestock mingling with the prayers of mothers. The city was rough, but it breathed, and in the mornings, when fog drifted over the Tiber and the fires from the night before still smoldered, one could stand at the edge of the hills and feel it the weight of something vast just beginning to wake. The wolves still watched from the tree line. The ghosts of old Etruscan kings whispered in dreams, and beneath the ground, in the hush where roots clutched bone, the past waited, not as a warning, but as a cradle, for Rome was not built in haste. It unfolded like a story told at dusk, each chapter laid upon the last with care and cruelty in equal measure. And in that soft beginning with mist on the grass and myth in the air, the empire's heartbeat began, slow and steady, beneath the 7 hills. It is said that Romulus disappeared not into death, but into the wind taken up in a storm as the sky bled red and thunder rumbled through the bones of the hills. Some claimed the gods carried him to the heavens, that he now watched from above as Rome marched forward without him. Others whispered that he had simply vanished, swallowed by the very city he had built with his brother's blood. Either way, Romulus was gone, and in his place remained a city, still fragile but no longer crawling. It stood, not as a finished crown, but as a foundation, rough-edged and untamed. The early kings that followed wore their power like animal skins, heavy, raw, and still red at the seams. They ruled from the Palatine Hill, where goats once grazed, and gave orders in a tongue sharpened by warfare and warning. Numa Pompilius, who came after Romulus, was a different shape of man, not a warrior, but a whisperer. He spoke to gods in the quiet and listened to omens in the flight of birds. Where Romulus had conquered with the blade, Numa tamed with ritual. He gave the people temples, calendars, sacred rites, and the long, slow rhythm of prayer. In Numa's time, the city breathed softer. The streets echoed less with iron and more with incense. He believed that power should kneel before divinity, not for fear, but for balance. And so the gods became part of the stone and soil. They were no longer distant. They lived in every hearth, watched over every home. Yet peace never stayed long in Rome. After Numa came Tullus Hostilius, who woke the legions once more and carried them toward Alba Longa, the mother city of Rome, as if destiny demanded that the child devour its own parent. It was in those days that stories thickened into legend of triplet champions chosen to fight for honor, of blades clashing while crowds held their breath. The city did not simply grow, it remembered. Every drop of blood, every oath sworn on a spear, was folded into its bones. When Ancus Marcius came next, he mixed the sacred with the practical. He built the first bridge over the Tiber, stretching Rome's fingers beyond the river's breadth. He understood something vital that for Rome to survive, it must touch everything: rivers, hills, roads, souls. So he dug ditches and raised walls, and every stone whispered a single word forward. Then came Tarquin the Elder, who arrived not from Roman blood, but from Etruscan breath. A foreigner, a dreamer, a man who saw Rome not just as a city, but as a stage for spectacle. He brought the grandeur of Etruscan pomp gold, games, augurs, slaves, and gave Rome a taste of splendor. He carved the Circus Maximus from the earth, where horses thundered and crowds roared like fire. Yet beneath the cheers, something stirred unease. For Rome had always balanced on a knife's edge, proud of its roughness, wary of too much softness, too much spectacle. But Tarquin ruled long, and when he fell, he was replaced by Servius Tullius, the fire-born slave, the king of strange origin. Some said flames danced on his head when he was a boy. Some said he was born from the hearth, a child of fate. He reshaped the city with census and citizenship, building layers into society like rings in a tree. Under him, the idea of Rome grew thicker, heavier, harder to lift, but harder to break. And then came Tarquin the Proud, not a man of whispers or ritual, but a shadow sharpened into flesh. He ruled like a storm, silencing opposition with cruelty. And Rome, like a body resisting a fever, began to shiver. The final spark was a woman, Lucretia. Her name, gentle as wind, now etched in fire. She was noble, chaste, and wronged. When she died by her own hand, having been shamed by the king's son, the city rose in grief and fury. It was not just her death that broke the crown. It was what she represented: honor without defense, dignity without power. The people cried out, not for justice, but for change. And change came, swift and brutal. The kings were driven out, the Tarquins fled, and in their place, a republic was born, not from peaceful thought, but from the deep, aching roar of a people who would no longer kneel. The sky above Rome that day glowed with strange light, neither dawn nor dusk, and some claimed they saw the spirit of Romulus drifting once more, watching, silent, as his city shed its skin. The Republic, young and unsteady, was not the end of Rome's growing pains, but the beginning of its true hunger. The monarchy's fall was not a quiet shift of power, but a wound that never fully healed. The Senate rose not a place of calm, but of ambition stitched into ritual. 2 consuls ruled together, their power temporary and trembling. Laws were written on bronze, then on stone, then on hearts, and always, behind every vote, behind every speech, behind every gesture of liberty, there lingered the memory of kings, of tyranny, of Tarquin's shadow. Rome had broken the crown, but the ghost of it still haunted the marble, as if every Roman, deep in their marrow, still remembered the feel of a collar around their neck. And so, freedom was not celebrated, it was defended, tooth and nail, law and dagger. In the Forum, voices clashed. In the streets, riots simmered. The patricians, proud and ancient, guarded their rights like wolves over carrion. The plebeians, many and hungry, demanded more say, more bread, more dignity. And the city, like a pot left too long on flame, began to bubble. But it did not boil over. It changed, slowly, painfully, but undeniably. Tribunes were born from protest. The 12 tables were etched into memory. The Republic did not erase the monarchy, it carried its memory like a scar, a reminder to never sleep too deeply. Rome was now a city of laws, but also of longing, for power, for order, for greatness. The hills still stood, the river still whispered, but the people, once scattered tribes, were now something more: a body, a machine, a city not of kings, but of will. And overhead, the gods quiet, watching, waited. The kings were gone, their thrones shattered, their statues crumbled or defaced, but the air in Rome still held the scent of their memory, faint as old incense on temple walls. In their place rose something quieter, but no less commanding: the Senate, a council of the old, the landed, the proud patricians who wore togas like armor and spoke with voices tempered by lineage. Yet even as they deliberated in shaded halls and carved laws onto bronze, the pulse of the Republic trembled with contradiction. Power, after all, cannot be dissolved. It only changes hands, shifting like smoke into new vessels. The consuls, elected each year, were given lictors and fasces, symbols of command and warning. They sat together, 2 figures sharing one chair in spirit, each meant to check the other, to prevent a new crown from forming in secret. And yet, behind every cautious balance, every temporary office, every elaborate ritual of limitation, there thrived the same desire that had once burned in kings: to rule, to endure, to shape the city in one's image. In the early days of the Republic, that desire was dressed in humility, cloaked in civic virtue, hidden behind the veil of service. Men like Lucius Quintius, Cincinnatus were summoned from their plow to wield absolute power, only to return to the soil when the danger had passed, a gesture both admired and feared, because the Romans knew what that power tasted like: sweet, intoxicating, dangerous. They praised those who surrendered it, but they watched those who held it too long. And so the Republic danced with its own limits. It gave power and took it back. It tested itself constantly, like a soldier sharpening a blade not for use, but for the promise of readiness. Yet beyond the marble columns and senatorial debates, Beyond the formalities of vetoes and tribunes, there lived another Rome, a Rome of alleys and markets, of taverns and laundries, where bakers rose before the sun and mothers whispered prayers over feverish children. This Rome did not care for speeches or processions. It cared for grain, for water, for protection. And so, to keep this city alive, the Republic had to reach beyond itself. It had to stretch its arms outward, first to the nearby tribes, the Sabines, the Volsci, the Aequi, then further, as each victory added land. Each land added citizens, and each citizen added complexity. What had once been a city of huts became a web of alliances, treaties, and obligations. Roads, at first no more than muddy trails, began to harden under stone. Aqueducts emerged, quiet rivers in the sky, and beneath it all, the Senate kept murmuring, drafting decrees, maneuvering between pride and pragmatism. In times of crisis, when war howled at the gates or famine stalked the countryside, the old fear would return, the dread of monarchy. But instead of crowning a king, the Romans crowned time itself. They chose a dictator, not a tyrant by name, but a caretaker of emergency. One man, total power, 6 months. That was the promise. A firebreak, a seal against chaos, and for a time, it worked. The Republic held firm. It endured wars, betrayals, natural disasters, and internal strife. But with each generation, as the memory of Tarquin grew fainter, the mechanisms of restraint became more brittle. The Senate, once a guardian of liberty, began to feel more like a gatekeeper of privilege. Wealth pooled in fewer hands. Landed elites grew fat on conquest, while the common farmer returned from war to find his fields in ruin and his voice in the forum drowned out by gold. The tribunes of the plebs, once a shield against abuse, now found themselves negotiating with shadows, promises unkept, laws delayed, reforms buried beneath ceremony. Yet Rome pressed on. It conquered, it colonized, it brought the Latin League to heel and made Italy a patchwork of Roman will. The people, restless and proud, found their pride in victories. A new kind of citizen soldier emerged, one who fought for Rome but returned to find himself more expendable than ever. And so began the great tension, soft at first but growing between those who ruled and those who served, between patrician and plebeian, between senate and street. Reformers would rise, men like the Gracchi brothers, who spoke of land, justice, and bread, and they would fall, violently, as the Republic clenched its teeth. But their words did not vanish. They lingered, like smoke after fire, like footprints after rain. They haunted the streets, echoed in the baths, flickered behind closed doors. Rome was still a republic, but it had begun to forget why. Laws remained, but their spirit weakened. Debates continued, but their substance faded. And in the distance, always, there loomed the armies, the legions raised by generals more loyal to their commanders than to the city itself. These legions didn't sleep beneath Rome's rooftops. They marched in Gaul, in Spain, in Greece. They built roads and bridges with their bare hands, and they waited. The Republic had once feared kings. Now it feared generals. For in the shadow of the Senate, a new kind of crown began to shimmer, not golden, not jeweled, but carried in the cheers of soldiers and the silent gratitude of a hungry crowd. The Republic had endured centuries of turmoil, and yet it had begun to change shape, not by revolution, but by erosion, slowly, patiently, like water carving a canyon. The forms remained, the rituals were intact, but the soul, the fierce civic flame that once burned in the eyes of men like Brutus, flickered. There were still elections, still oaths, still the grandeur of the forum, but behind the marble, cracks spread, behind the toga, ambition sharpened, and still, Rome marched on outward, ever outward, into Sicily, into Carthage, into Greece. Its conquests filled its coffers, fed its games, clothed its citizens in silk, and entertained them with tales of distant beasts and stranger gods. But with each victory, it carried home something unseen, the seeds of its own undoing. The Republic, once proud and sparse, now wore robes of silk over bones of discontent. And in the Senate, even as orders spoke of virtue, the city itself began to listen less, for it was no longer the speeches that shaped Rome, it was the silences between them, the spaces where power moved unseen, where the will of the people, once mighty, now drifted like dust across the stones of the Forum. In the long warmth of the Mediterranean sun, Rome began to drape itself in stone. What had once been a village of thatched roofs and wooden fences gradually transformed into a city of columns, arches, and enduring marble. The streets widened, the walls thickened, and the scent of mortar mingled with the dust of ambition. It was not sudden, it was a slow blossoming, like vines curling up a wall, persistent and quiet. Rome was no longer merely a city, it was a statement, a symbol, a center toward which roads stretched like veins from distant provinces. These roads, paved with the sweat of soldiers and slaves, carried more than just wagons and legions. They carried ideas. Trade moved along them: oil from Hispania, glass from Syria, grain from Egypt, and whispers from everywhere in between. Rome had discovered something crucial. Power was not only in the sword, but in the structure. It built to endure. Aqueducts lifted water from faraway springs into the heart of the city, singing a song of engineering through the arches that cut across fields and valleys. Public baths rose, echoing with laughter and debate. Temples gleamed under the sun, their gods dressed in Greek likenesses, renamed and reimagined, but still honored with garlands and sacrifice. The Forum became the heartbeat, its stones worn smooth by the sandals of ardors and citizens, a place where law, gossip, and prophecy collided under the open sky. Yet beneath this splendor lay tension. Quiet as a coiled rope, the Republic still spoke of liberty, but the people began to crave spectacle. Bread and games, stability over principle, order over debate, and so the city grew upward, outward, but also inward, drawing its citizens into a rhythm where routines replaced reflection. Still, Rome expanded. The legions marched through forests where strange tongues whispered and foreign gods held sway. Gaul, Illyria, Macedonia, Numidia, lands whose names fell heavily on Roman tongues, and whose soil would one day carry Latin footsteps. The legions were more than soldiers. They were builders, diplomats, farmers with shields. Where they camped, cities rose. Where they conquered, Rome took root. It offered roads, laws, amphitheaters, markets, but it also demanded loyalty. Citizenship was a prize, a distant light for the conquered to chase, and in time, many did. Rome, for all its cruelty, knew how to bind people together with coin, with law, with shared enemies. In provinces far from the Tiber, Roman mosaics began to appear in dining halls, Latin phrases etched onto tombs, Roman gods paired beside local deities like guests at a banquet. Yet, with every new territory, with every tribute sent home, came something else: slaves. War fed the markets. The villas of the wealthy swelled with foreign hands. Greeks, Africans, Celts laboring in kitchens, fields, and libraries. Even the minds of the conquered were put to use. Roman education grew fat on Greek philosophy. Roman art leaned on Hellenistic grace. And the Roman soul, once carved from iron, began to soften under marble. Meanwhile, back in the city, the old families, the patricians, watched the city shift with wary pride. Their sons studied rhetoric, their daughters were weighed by dowries, and their names echoed in marble plaques and family tombs. But power was no longer just inherited. It was purchased, seized, voted upon by hands that could be swayed with coin or promises. The equestrians, those wealthy enough to afford horses but not born into the Senate, pressed closer, their ambition dressed in civility, and the plebeians, restless, watched from the steps, hoping for grain, for justice, for meaning. In the midst of this teeming city, religion pulsed like a heartbeat. The Vestal virgins kept their eternal flame alight, and augurs still studied the flight of birds before decisions were made. But something had changed. The gods no longer felt near. They had become symbols, distant and ceremonial. Rituals persisted, but belief had thinned. Rome still sacrificed, still prayed, but now more out of duty than devotion. A sacrifice became a requirement, not a communion. And in that slow detachment, the space between citizen and divinity widened. Still, the structures stood. Still, the city glowed. In the evenings, when the sun dipped low and the Tiber caught its last golden sigh, Rome shimmered. People spilled into the streets. Vendors called out wares, and beneath porticos, voices debated poetry and law. It was a city both alive and asleep, dreaming of greatness, fearing decay, and always, in the distance, the soldiers marched. Rome was at peace with the world only when it was marching upon it. The Senate passed laws, yes, but the generals shaped reality. Their names became songs in distant provinces. Their victories, paraded through the city with chariots and garlands, became feasts for the people's hunger. Triumphs were declared with trumpets and incense. Statues rose, coins were minted, and slowly, the generals began to taste a kind of power the Senate could not offer: the love of the crowd. For the people, tired of slow laws and faster hunger, wanted heroes, men of action, and the Senate, once feared, now seemed like an old man mumbling in the corner while the world danced. The balance had begun to tilt, but for now, Rome basked in its own brilliance. The columns stood tall, the baths steamed, the markets overflowed. There was music in the taverns and murmurs in the temples. The olive trees bore fruit. The grain ships sailed from Alexandria. And the city, for a moment, believed in itself, believed that its empire would never end, that the stones they laid would outlive time, that the sun would always set behind Roman walls. And the people slept, unaware that the foundations beneath them had begun to tremble. The roads of empire stretched like arteries, carved into the earth with purpose, linking port to port, city to outpost, province to Rome. Upon these stones marched the slow thunder of legions, not in haste, but with the steady rhythm of certainty. Sandaled feet struck the ground in perfect cadence, shields glinting beneath a restless sun, banners fluttering like whispered prophecy. Each legionary carried not only arms and armor, but the weight of a world growing larger with every step. They slept in disciplined silence beneath canvas tents, ate hard bread and vinegar wine, dug trenches and raised walls before dusk. The march was not a means to battle, but a ritual of becoming. For the Roman soldier was not merely a fighter, but a builder, a citizen, a symbol. Across the Alps they marched, carving their path through rock and ice, their red crests stark against the white of northern frost. In the forests of Germania, they moved like breath through trees, always outnumbered but never outdrilled. Through Gaul they swept, laying down roads as they raised standards, bringing with them not only war but waterworks, language, and law. In Hispania, they traced the jagged coastline, setting down stones where only shepherds had wandered before. Every conquered land, once resisting, slowly bent not only to Rome's will, but to its rhythm. The sound of Latin, spoken first in command, later filled marketplaces and homes. The weights used to measure grain matched those in the forum. Amphitheaters sprang up like stone flowers. Roman baths steamed in cities that once knew only mud and wind. Yet for all the glory in marble, conquest began in blood. The legions were not gentle. They besieged. They starved cities into surrender. They razed villages that didn't bow. They crucified rebels, enslaved survivors, salted fields. But when the fires cooled, when the ashes settled, the empire built. A city might wake one day to smoke and mourning, and within years find itself adorned with arches and aqueducts, its young men conscripted into the very legions that once crushed them. This was Rome's method, harsh, but seductive. It punished disobedience with ferocity, yet offered belonging with equal conviction, a place in the system, a path to citizenship, a new name carved into stone. The legions did not just carry war, they carried identity. To serve Rome was to become Rome. And so, in the far reaches of Syria, a soldier might write home in Latin. In Africa, roads led to cities whose laws mirrored those of the capital. In Britain, beneath the northern fog, a legionary might dine on garum and olives while locals watched, uncertain, from the trees. And always, the march continued. The empire was not content to hold. It was made to press forward, to test the edge of its reach. Each new frontier whispered the same temptation, just a little further, just one more river, one more mountain range. But each new conquest also brought distance between Senate and sword, between decree and decision. For the generals commanding these legions, days and weeks from Rome, grew accustomed to ruling without permission. They were not merely warriors, they were governors, judges, architects. Their words reshaped lives, and when they returned home, if they returned, they came not only with spoils and songs, but with power, real, undeniable power. Power born not from family or law, but from loyalty of men who would die at their side, who followed them not out of duty, but devotion. Rome, the Republic, began to tremble under the weight of this loyalty, for the Senate could no longer command what it could not touch. The legions listened to their generals, and the people, watching from balconies and rooftops, began to cheer not for the Senate, but for names like Pompey, like Crassus, like Caesar. In the streets, where once the deeds of Cincinnatus were sung, now echoed tales of faraway victories, of naval blockades and mountain crossings, of cities taken and kings humbled. Rome had become addicted to glory, and the legions were its dealers. But glory has a cost. The soil of Italy was rich with the blood of its own. With each new campaign, more farmers left their fields to fight. Many did not return. Their lands, neglected, were bought by the wealthy, turned into vast estates worked by slaves. The countryside emptied, the city swelled. Displaced citizens crowded tenements, waited in line for grain, grew restless and ripe for persuasion. And in this unrest, the legions loomed not in the distance, but in the minds of men who saw in military command the clearest path to control. Caesar saw it most clearly. He knew that a legion was more than a military unit. It was a voice, a fist, a promise. He led them across Gaul, into Germania, over rivers thought impassable. He wrote of his deeds, not in private letters, but in careful, public words, the commentaries, a dispatch not just to the Senate, but to history. His soldiers loved him. They fought not for the Republic, but for Caesar. They followed him because he walked with them, bled beside them, knew their names. And when the time came, when the Senate trembled at his ambition and demanded his return without his army, Caesar made a choice. He crossed the Rubicon, a small river, a great act, not just of defiance, but of transformation. The Republic would never be the same. In that single step, history lurched forward for the legions. Once the arms of the Senate had now become the vehicle of its undoing. They were no longer instruments of the state. They were the state. And as Caesar marched into Rome, unopposed, the city did not resist. It opened its gates, because beneath the fear was something deeper, a yearning for order, for strength, for someone who could carry the burdens the Senate no longer could. The people had grown tired of division, tired of debate. They wanted a voice that did not quiver, a hand that did not shake, and in the footsteps of the legions, they found it. The thunder had arrived, not loud, not crashing, but steady, slow, inevitable. The streets of Rome, once paved with the solemn strides of statesmen and the steady tramp of soldiers' boots, began to echo with a new rhythm, the clamoring of sandals rushing toward spectacle, the laughter of children chasing crumbs, the distant roar of crowds in stone arenas built not for prayer or counsel, but for distraction. The city no longer listened for wisdom, it waited for entertainment. The amphitheaters pulsed like hearts at the center of every district, their arched bellies swallowing thousands at a time. The Colosseum, vast and aching with grandeur, opened its jaws to the mob with a majesty that shamed temples. Here, beneath marbled tiers and awnings stretched like the sails of a ship, the citizens of the empire feasted their eyes on death, dressed as drama. Gladiators stood beneath the sun with skins slick from oil and sweat, eyes hard like hammered bronze. Some were slaves, trained to kill for survival. Others volunteered, hungry for glory, for coin, or simply for a name whispered beyond the grave. Lions prowled behind hidden doors, exotic beasts from the far ends of empire, rhinoceroses from Africa, tigers from the east. Strange horned creatures, never named in Latin, were unleashed upon the sand to remind the people of Rome's reach, of its dominion over not just men, but nature itself. Blood spilled, cheers rose, and for a few hours, all fear melted into fascination. The bread was free grain, doled out monthly to citizens who registered their names in long, winding lines, and the circus was constant. A people fed and entertained were a people content, or so the Senate believed. But beneath the applause, a different silence grew, the silence of those who watched without cheering, of the old, who remembered when triumph meant civic duty, not stage cruelty, of the poor, who chewed the crust of free bread while dreaming of work that once gave dignity, of thinkers, poets, philosophers, who wondered if a people lulled by spectacle might one day forget the very spirit of their republic. And yet, no rebellion rose with swords. The rebellion was quieter, hidden in satire, in whispers passed in wine-soaked corners, in graffiti scrawled at night on crumbling walls. Names like Gracchus, once spoken with hope, now returned like ghosts. Tiberius and Gaius brothers who had tried to reform the republic through laws that favored the landless, only to be silenced by clubs and chaos. Their memories remained, not honored by statues, but etched in size. The citizens still voted, still assembled in the forum, but their choices narrowed with each passing year. Political machines tightened their grip, promising grain and games in exchange for silence. Corruption, once whispered, became expected. Offices were purchased like jewelry, votes were bought in coin and promises, and laws bent like reeds beneath a storm. And the people, many of them, accepted this not because they were blind, but because they were weary. War had filled the city with wealth and confusion. Foreigners came in waves, artisans, traders, slaves, and the native poor often found themselves edged out, their voices lost in the new, swelling crowd. The city was louder than ever, yet lonelier too. Tenement blocks, called insulae, climbed high and leaned close, creaking with the weight of too many souls. Fires spread often, roofs collapsed. In the alleys below, cats and children picked through refuse alike. By night, songs were sung to gods long abandoned. Lamps flickered behind cracked shutters. Men sat in silence, staring at the walls, remembering a republic they never truly knew. The plebeians, once a political force, had become a symbol honored in rhetoric, ignored in reality. The tribunes still spoke, but their words rang hollow, often tangled in alliances with patrician patrons. And the Senate, it remained, a body cloaked in ceremony and pride, still adorned in purple-trimmed togas, still quoting Cicero and invoking the virtues of old, but its heart beat slower now, smothered under the weight of its own rituals. It could not keep pace with the world it once ruled. Rome had outgrown its republic, and in doing so, it began to reshape its soul. The family unit, once sacred, fractured. Fathers lost authority to the streets, where gangs of political enforcers offered protection or punishment in equal measure. Sons grew up watching gladiators, not senators. Daughters were married off like strategic pieces in a game played by men with maps. Religion, too, changed. The old gods remained, their temples still dusted and perfumed, but new deities slipped in through cracks in the stone. Cults arrived from the east: Isis, Mithras, Cybele promising rebirth, mystery, eternal life. Their ceremonies were secret, their appeals emotional, their gods closer, more personal. The people, in their uncertainty, leaned toward them. The rituals were darker, deeper, more desperate, a mirror to the city's own growing unease. And still, the circus played. Chariots thundered in the Circus Maximus, turning hairpin laps as thousands screamed for color: red, green, blue, white, the teams more adored than any senator. Their drivers idolized, cursed, immortalized in song and statue. Coins were tossed, fortunes made and lost. The city lived on momentum, and in that endless movement, it began to forget its direction. Provinces were still governed, legions still won battles. Emperors came and went, each draped in wreaths and followed by shadows. But for the common citizen, power became more myth than memory. It lived far above them in marble halls, on distant campaigns, behind layers of gold and guards. The Republic, in spirit, had become performance a stage play in which everyone knew the lines but no longer believed the story. And yet, the rebellion remained quiet, watchful. It lived in the poets who rapped protest in verse, in the historians who hinted at rot between their lines of praise, in the mothers who whispered to their children tales not of games, but of men who once stood in the forum with fire in their voice and truth in their hearts. The rebellion waited, not to overthrow, but to remember. For in the heart of even the most distracted citizen, a flicker remained of a Rome that was once small, once hungry, once honest, a Rome of fields, of votes that mattered, of virtues practiced rather than preached. That memory, faded and threadbare, still stirred, not loudly, not enough to shake the circus, but enough to linger in the silence that followed each cheer, enough to remind the city, if only in dreams, of what it had been and what it had lost beneath the roar of the crowd. Far across the shimmering curve of the Mediterranean, where the sun fell harsh upon white stone and salt air twisted through the cedars, there stood another city, proud, wealthy, and ancient, Carthage. Her walls rose like a fortress against the sea, her harbors shaped like half-moons drawn by gods, and her ships sliced the waves with sails that had carried purple dye and silver ingots long before Rome was more than a whisper beside the Tiber. If Rome was the child of wolves, Carthage was the daughter of trade winds, sleek, sharp, rich in coin and cleverness. She did not conquer through marching boots, but through contracts and cargo. Her empire clung to coastlines and reached across waters like fingers eager to grasp. The two cities, Rome and Carthage, were destined to meet, not as neighbors, but as rivals pulled by gravity into the clash of inevitability. They both craved the same sun, the same sea, the same illusion of permanence. The First Punic War began not with fury but with hesitation over a squabble in Sicily, a territory too rich to ignore, too near to leave alone. Rome, inexperienced at sea, threw herself into naval war like a youth learning to swim in stormy waters. Carthage, master of the waves, laughed at first, but Rome learned. She built fleets from nothing, trained sailors who had never seen the sea, and with iron will and wooden planks, she began to turn the tide. Battles at Mylae, at Ecnomus, at the agates names that would be etched in Roman pride were not won by chance, but by Roman stubbornness. When ships sank, they built more. When storms destroyed fleets, they rebuilt. They did not yield. And in time, Carthage bent. The war ended not with a roar, but with quiet terms and heavy payments. Rome now held Sicily, then Sardinia, then Corsica. The sea, once Carthaginian, had changed its allegiance. But Carthage did not forget, and neither did Rome. The second meeting would not be a war of fleets. It would be a march of monsters. For from Carthage came a name that would haunt Rome's memory for generations. Hannibal. He didn't ride the sea, he crossed the Alps, dragging with him elephants, soldiers, and a hatred carved by years of humiliation. The mountains, covered in snow and silence, echoed with the grunt of beasts not meant for such cold, with the curses of men who doubted the path. But Hannibal persisted. He descended into Italy not like an invader, but like a storm that the sky itself had released. At Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, and most devastatingly at Cannae, Hannibal broke the Roman army like a vase dashed against stone. Tens of thousands died. Roman blood soaked Roman soil. Panic whispered through the streets of the city. The gates were shut. The people feared the worst. And yet Rome endured. She did not surrender. She did not negotiate. She recalled old values, old names. Fabius Maximus, the delayer, stepped into history with the patience of stone, avoiding battle, harassing supply lines, buying time that Rome would use to grow strong again. Carthage, far away and stretched thin, could not reinforce Hannibal as he needed, and so the war turned once more. Publius Cornelius Scipio, later to be called Africanus, studied Hannibal, mimicked him, respected him, and then did what few dared. He carried war back to Carthage's doorstep. At Zama, the fate of two civilizations hung in the balance. Elephants charged, Spears flew, dust clouded the sun, and Rome won. Carthage, proud Carthage, fell not in fire, but in silence. She paid her dues, she bowed, but Rome never forgot the fear. And fear, in Rome, became reason. Reason for conquest, reason for control, reason for vengeance. Decades later, when Carthage had rebuilt herself with quiet dignity, trading once more, thriving in small ways, Rome looked again toward her sister city with suspicion. Voices in the Senate most loudly. Cato the Elder ended every speech with the same words. Regardless of topic, Carthage must be destroyed. And in time, it was. The Third Punic War was not a war. It was a sentence. Rome laid siege. Carthage resisted. For 3 years she held, her citizens starving but proud. When the walls finally broke, the Romans came not as victors, but as executioners. They killed without mercy. They burned the city to ash. They razed temples, homes, memories. They poured salt into the soil so nothing would grow. And in that final act, Rome declared something to the world that there would be no rival. Not now, not ever. But even as Carthage died, her ghost rose, not to haunt Rome, but to whisper, to remind. That power built on fear does not settle. It itches, it trembles, it demands more. Rome had destroyed her enemy, and in doing so, she had stepped deeper into a path she could not leave. The wars no longer felt like defense. They became appetite. The provinces multiplied. Spain, Greece, North Africa, Asia Minor, all drawn into Rome's grasp. And with each conquest came new wealth, new slaves, new expectations. The Senate, now swollen with men enriched by war, began to split. The people, weary of endless battles, wanted rest but also reward. Veterans expected land. Citizens expected grain. The machine had to keep feeding. Carthage had fallen, but Rome had grown hungrier. The spirit of the Republic, already tired, now gasped beneath the weight of victory. And in the markets, in the temples, in the corridors of power, the name of Hannibal was still spoken, not in fear, but in awe. For though he had lost, he had reminded Rome of its mortality, of the thin line between glory and ruin. And as the Tiber flowed through the heart of the city, winding past shrines and Senate steps, it carried with it the quiet memory of a time when Rome nearly broke, a memory that would guide her future with both pride and caution. For Carthage had been an enemy, but she had also been a mirror, and Rome, having shattered her, now stared only at herself. The city of Rome stood triumphant, crowned in laurel and stitched together with marble. Her arms stretched across the known world like the embrace of a giant. Her enemies lay broken, her lands expanded, her name carved into the hearts of conquered peoples and foreign kings. But within her core, something vital had begun to rot. The Republic, once forged in the heat of rebellion against tyranny, now sagged beneath the weight of its own victories. Senators debated not for principle, but for profit. Laws were passed not with care, but with calculation. And in the streets below their marbled halls, the people no longer listened with hope, but with suspicion. Grain was still distributed, the games still staged, but the spirit of civic virtue, that quiet, burning sense of shared purpose, had withered like a flower left too long in the sun. The elite had grown fat on conquest. Their estates sprawled across the Italian countryside, tended by slaves, while the small farmer, the old Roman backbone, was slowly erased. Veterans returned from war expecting land, only to find their plots absorbed by wealthier hands. They drifted to the cities, hungry, disillusioned, and vulnerable to anyone who promised them bread and dignity. In this swelling unrest, new names began to stir the air, not the names of old noble houses, but of men whose power came not from bloodline, but from will. Gaius Marius, a plebeian by birth, rose through sheer determination, becoming consul not once, but 7 times. He reformed the military, allowing the landless poor to serve, giving them purpose and, in return, securing their loyalty. The legions were no longer the republics, they were the generals. And behind him, shadows grew. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, his rival, his mirror, emerged with equal ambition. He too saw the way the system bent, how the Senate faltered, how the people hungered, and when conflict flared, it did not remain in the Senate or in the courts, it spilled into blood. Rome turned on itself. Armies marched on the city, not from foreign lands, but from Roman soil. It was a line no one thought would be crossed, and once crossed, it could never be erased. Sulla seized power, declared himself a dictator, and began a purge. Lists were posted in the form names of enemies, of dissenters, of rivals. They were hunted, executed, their property seized, their families ruined. The Republic, once guarded by law, now trembled under personal vengeance. When Sulla finally stepped down, claiming he had restored order, the damage was already done. Rome had learned that might could overrule legality, that the sword could silence the Senate, and in that silence, more figures rose. Crassus, the richest man in Rome, who bought influence like marble for a villa. Pompey, the brilliant general who bathed in the glory of Eastern campaigns, and Julius Caesar, sharp as a blade, watching, learning, waiting. These three formed the first triumvirate, an alliance of ambition, cloaked in cooperation, designed to bypass the slow-moving limbs of the Republic. They divided power as one divides a map, carving spheres of influence while pretending harmony. But ambition is a fire that doesn't share its warmth. Crassus fell first. His dreams burned in Parthian sands. Pompey and Caesar, once allies, now turned their eyes toward each other with growing suspicion. The Senate, fearful of Caesar's rising star, ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome alone. It was a test, a demand, a line drawn in the dust. And Caesar, standing on the banks of the Rubicon, chose defiance. He crossed the river with his legion, quiet and deliberate, and in that act, the Republic cracked. He marched on Rome, not with rage, but with inevitability. The people did not resist. They cheered. For Caesar, to them, was not a threat, he was hope. Bread had returned under his watch. Order followed his name, and the Senate, once mighty, seemed to tremble like old parchment in a breeze. Pompey fled, the last great champion of the Senate's authority. Battles followed Pharsalus, Thapsus, Munda, and with each victory, Caesar tightened his grip. He was declared dictator for 10 years, then for life. He restructured debt, settled veterans, reformed the calendar, but with each step, he stood further above the law, and the Senate, humiliated and cornered, whispered of freedom. And so, on the Ides of March, beneath the cool stone of the Curia, the knives were drawn. Senators, many of whom had once basked in Caesar's light, turned on him with desperate hands. Brutus, Cassius, and others stabbed him again and again, not as men killing a tyrant, but as a republic gasping for air. Caesar fell at the foot of Pompey's statue, the last breath of a dying republic, expiring beneath the image of its old protector. But his death did not save the republic. It exposed its hollowness. The people did not rejoice. They wept, they rioted, they burned. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal ally, seized the moment, inflaming the crowd with Caesar's will, with his bloodied toga, with fiery words that made murder seem treason. And from the ashes, yet another alliance was born. The second triumvirate, Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus rose not in the name of the Republic, but in the shadow of revenge. They hunted the assassins, declared prescriptions, spilled blood in the streets. Brutus and Cassius, having fled to the east, were defeated at Philippi. The Republic was avenged, but it was not restored. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, watched the others carefully. He waited as Lepidus faded into irrelevance. He maneuvered as Antony, tangled with Cleopatra in the exotic glamour of Egypt, lost favor in Rome. And when the time was right, Octavian declared war not on Antony directly, but on Cleopatra, the foreign queen, the seductress. The other, the people, still swayed by fears of Eastern decadence, supported him. The final battle came at Actium, where ships clashed and alliances shattered. Antony and Cleopatra, defeated, chose death and Octavian returned to Rome not as a warlord, but as a savior. He knew better than to crown himself king. He kept the titles modest first citizen, princeps, Augustus, but the truth was clear. The Republic was gone, not with a bang, but with a sigh. The Senate remained, but now it stood only when Augustus entered. The laws passed, but only as he desired. The people still voted, but only in theater. The ashes of the Republic were swept beneath layers of ceremony, and above them, a new Rome rose imperial, ordered, quiet in its surrender. The name of Caesar became not a title, but a dynasty. The dream of shared governance faded like mist at dawn, and yet, Rome endured. She always did. It was not a wide river. The Rubicon flowed narrow and shallow, its waters quiet, ordinary, threading through the green of the northern Italian landscape like any other stream under the Roman sky. Cattle drank from it. Merchants crossed it without thought. Children played at its edge, never knowing that one day, its name would echo like thunder across centuries. The river itself didn't change when Caesar came to it. It didn't rise in warning or darken in omen. It simply flowed, indifferent. But for the man who stood upon its bank, the choice before him was heavier than any battle fought before. Julius Caesar, commander of Gaul, conqueror of tribes that once seemed mythical, beloved by his legions and feared by the Senate, had reached a moment from which there was no return. Behind him, a decade of war, loyalty, and rising glory. Before him, Rome not the city, but the idea, the Republic, frayed but still standing. Its laws, its rituals, its pride, and yet, it was that very pride that had demanded his return as a private citizen, stripped of his command, vulnerable to prosecution and political ruin. The Senate, guided by Pompey and Caesar's old rivals, feared what he had become, and they were right to fear, for Caesar, more than a general, had become a symbol of victory, of change, of power unbound. He knew what crossing that thin stream would mean. He knew the weight of the act, the finality of its gesture. It was a step out of legality and into destiny. And so he crossed, without trumpet or ceremony, without fanfare, just men, weapons, silence, and a will too large for the old structures to contain. Alia iacta est, the die is cast. He is said to have whispered, not as a boast, but as a truth already etched into the stones beneath his feet. Word reached Rome like lightning. Panic spread through the Senate. Meetings dissolved into arguments. Pompey, who once stood beside Caesar in alliance, now stood against him in alarm. He had the Senate's support, but not its confidence. As Caesar approached, cities opened their gates rather than resist. His march was not a siege, it was a procession. For every soldier behind him walked not as a servant of empire, but as a devotee of Caesar himself. Loyalty to Rome had become loyalty to the man who gave them land, pride, and victories. Pompey fled the city, retreating south, gathering forces, hoping for time. The Senate followed, abandoning the capital it was meant to guide. And Caesar entered Rome not as a tyrant, not with pillage, but with purpose. He did not claim the throne. He did not name himself king. He sent messages of clemency. He spoke of reconciliation. But even in mercy, there was a sharpness. For every act of kindness reminded the Senate that their power was now conditional, allowed, not absolute. Caesar pursued Pompey across Italy, then across the sea to Greece. At Pharsalus, the decisive blow fell. The battle was swift and brutal. Caesar's tactics, honed from years of fighting Gauls and Germans, outmaneuvered Pompey's larger forces. Roman clashed against Roman, cousin against cousin, citizen against citizen. And when the dust settled, Pompey fled again, this time to Egypt, where he was murdered before Caesar could even reach him. The blade meant for peace had instead silenced a man who might have still helped mend the old order. Caesar arrived in Alexandria to find Pompey already dead, his severed head presented as a gift by the boy king Ptolemy III. But Caesar did not smile. He turned away. Perhaps he had hoped for an ending less final, or perhaps he saw in Pompey's death a reflection of his own inevitable fate. Egypt, too, drew him into its web. Cleopatra, young and brilliant, wrapped in linen and legend, met him not as a queen in chains, but as a sovereign with secrets. Their union of mind, of body, of ambition, brought Caesar not only a son, but the allure of the East, of monarchy, of a different kind of rule. He stayed longer than expected. Whispers followed. In Rome, unease spread. Caesar had no rival left. Crassus was long dead. Pompey was ash. The Senate returned. But now it was a chorus, not a council. The tribunes bent to Caesar's will. Laws passed swiftly. Reforms bloomed. The calendar was reshaped. Debts addressed. Colonies founded. Veterans settled. Temples restored. To the people, it was a golden moment. The streets were orderly. The grain flowed. The games were lavish. But to the elite, to the guardians of the old republic, this peace felt like a cage lined with silk. Caesar accepted honors no Roman had dared. Statues, festivals, even the right to sit upon a throne at public games. He wore the purple robe of triumph too often. He named himself Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life, and though he never claimed the crown of a king, he brushed it, let it linger in the air, played with the symbol as one plays with fire. Rome had no more room for denial. This was not a republic in practice, it was a republic in name only. And so, the whispers began. Brutus, Cassius, men raised in the shadow of liberty, men who had fought by Caesar's side, now plotted in secret, not because they hated him, but because they feared what Rome was becoming. They spoke of the ancestors, of the Tarquins, of the Republic's sacred fire, and on the Ides of March, in the Senate chambers, as Caesar entered without bodyguard or suspicion, the daggers flashed. It was not swift, it was not clean. He fought them at first, then he saw Brutus, and he stopped. Et tu, Brute. The words, whether spoken or only imagined, became the final breath of a man who had reshaped the world. He fell not on the battlefield, but at the feet of men he trusted, and with him, the illusion of the Republic died. The conspirators had thought they were saving Rome. Instead, they had cut its tether. In the days that followed, confusion reigned. The Senate, paralyzed, the people, furious. Antony, ever shrewd, used Caesar's will, his funeral, his blood-stained toga, to inflame the masses. The conspirators fled. The streets turned red again. Caesar's death birthed not freedom, but a vacuum. Into it stepped Octavian, his adopted heir, quiet, calculating, young. He promised stability. He offered healing, but beneath his calm hand lay iron. And though he would never call himself emperor, Rome would come to know him as its first. The Rubicon, long behind, now faded into myth, but its crossing had never truly ended. Every step after had led Rome further from what it had been. The river was not a boundary, it was a beginning, a soft, slow, irreversible drift away from republic and into empire. The air on the morning of the Ides was sharp, almost ceremonial, as if the city itself held its breath beneath a sky washed pale with spring light. Rome had seen many mornings like this, with carts groaning over cobbled streets, vendors setting figs in baskets, priests whispering omens as smoke curled skyward from altars, and yet, this day felt different, though no one could yet say why. In the Senate House, marble columns caught the dawn like quiet witnesses, cold and unyielding. Beneath them, a gathering of men, noble by name but trembling in soul, prepared not to legislate, but to strike. They were not barbarians. They were not rebels. They were senators, guardians of Rome's soul, heirs to centuries of tradition. But now, blades hid beneath their robes, and words like freedom and tyranny whispered louder than prayers. When Julius Caesar arrived, he came without a bodyguard. That, perhaps more than anything, revealed the depth of his confidence or his blind spot. He entered as he always had, calm, assured, dignified in his flowing toga. The meeting began. Voices rose and fell, and then, at a signal, the circle closed. Hands grabbed his shoulders. The first blade pierced his flesh, and then another, and another. He twisted, recoiled, staggered, eyes wide, mouth parted not in command, but disbelief. He cried out, perhaps not from pain, but from recognition. When Brutus stepped forward, steel glinting in his hand, Caesar did not resist. Perhaps he had no strength left, or perhaps, in that final glance, he understood that the thing he had built, the weight of it, the brilliance of it, had grown too large to hold without betrayal. Et tu, brute. The words, whether uttered or only imagined, hung in the air like a last breath unclaimed. Then silence. He fell at the base of Pompey's statue, blood mingling with dust, destiny collapsing into irony. The senators stood, not as victors, but as men undone by their own hands. They had struck not at a man, but at a myth, and now the myth bled. Outside, the city pulsed, unaware of the wound carved in its chest. When word spread, it did not inspire celebration. It brought confusion. The citizens, many of whom had adored Caesar, did not see tyrannicide, they saw murder. They saw the death of the man who had given them grain, order, triumph. The conspirators emerged, stained in crimson, calling for liberty, raising their hands as if to conjure the ghost of the Republic. But Rome did not cheer. Rome did not rise in chorus. It watched, wary. The silence that followed the daggers was louder than any battle. Then, Mark Antony stepped forward, not as a general, but as an actor in the theater of grief. At Caesar's funeral, he spoke not as a friend, but as a fire starter. He held the bloodied robe. He read the will aloud, land and coin for every citizen. He invoked Caesar's victories, his mercy, his legacy, and when he pointed toward the flames consuming the dictator's body, he did not ask for justice. He let the crowd ask for it themselves. The city ignited. The conspirators fled. The streets turned wild. Effigies were burned. Homes stormed. The Senate, again, cowered in indecision. Into this chaos stepped another figure, one less known, less flamboyant, Gaius Octavius, named heir in Caesar's will, adopted son, barely 20. He had not marched in great campaigns. He had not won the favor of crowds with oratory, but he carried Caesar's name, and in Rome, names held weight. At first, few took him seriously. He was young, untested, more scholar than soldier, but Octavian moved with a quiet patience, gathering allies, speaking softly, always watching. He understood what the others did not. The power, once severed from tradition, could be worn like a new garment, and so he wore it carefully. He allied with Antony and Lepidus to form the Second Triumvirate, not in friendship, but in mutual necessity. They shared the Republic like men dividing spoils, and to cement their rule, they turned to the old tactic fear, prescriptions returned, names posted, heads hunted. Cicero, the great orator, who had spoken of liberty, fell by sword and silence, his tongue cut out, his hands nailed in the forum. Rome again remembered what it meant to speak too loudly. But the alliance was not built to last. Lepidus faded into irrelevance. Antony turned his gaze toward the east, and Octavian, always the quietest, became the strongest. Antony, in Egypt, fell under Cleopatra's spell, or so Octavian claimed. Whether it was love or strategy, Rome saw only threat. Cleopatra was a queen, a foreigner, a symbol of everything Rome feared. Octavian played his cards with precision. He spoke of Roman virtue, of threats from the east, of betrayal wrapped in silk and incense. He turned the people, the Senate, the very spirit of Rome against Antony and Cleopatra. At Actium, the decisive blow was struck. Antony's fleet faltered. Cleopatra fled. Antony followed. And when the walls of Alexandria closed around them, they chose death not as lovers of legend, but as rulers who knew the game was lost. Octavian entered the city not as a conqueror, but as a man collecting what was already his. He returned to Rome alone, sole ruler, no rivals, no pretenders. And yet, he refused the crown. He returned power to the Senate ceremonially. In practice, he kept everything. He became princeps, the first citizen. The Senate gave him the title Augustus, and the Republic, in name, survived. but it was no longer alive. It was embalmed, honored in speech, preserved in ritual, but no longer sovereign. Rome had become something else, an empire, ruled not by law, but by legacy. Augustus did not rule with brutality. He ruled with brilliance. He cloaked autocracy in the robes of restoration. He kept the forms, the facades, the ceremonies, but every decision passed through his hands. He reformed the army, the treasury, the calendar. He secured the borders. He built roads, temples, monuments, and slowly, the city exhaled. After decades of war, purges, uncertainty, the people embraced peace. Pax Romana, the Roman peace, began not with thunder, but with a soft surrender. The daggers had fallen, the silence had passed, and in its place came the hum of order. Streets swept clean, coin weighed evenly, laws enforced. Augustus had not revived the Republic. He had replaced it, but he did so gently. And in that gentleness, Rome forgot how to resist. The Ides were remembered. Caesar was deified. The Republic was honored in statues, but in every home, every province, every whisper, it was Augustus who ruled. And so, beneath a sky now calm, the empire breathed. After the blood had dried beneath the steps of the Curia, and Caesar's ashes had drifted into the Tiber's indifferent current, Rome was not free, she was dazed. The Republic did not stand restored like a patient healed, but staggered like a widow learning to walk alone again. Its soul had been pierced too deeply. The senators who thought they had struck a blow for liberty found themselves fleeing the very city they claimed to save, hounded not by armies, but by the people's grief. For Caesar, despite his overreach, had fed them. He had dazzled them. He had made them feel like Rome still mattered. And now, with his body broken and his voice silenced, the city shivered beneath a sky that seemed suddenly too wide. Into this hollow stepped a young man not with thunder, but with calculation. Gaius Octavius, barely 20, slight and pale, arrived not with legions, but with lineage. He was Caesar's adopted son, named in the will, marked by fate. No crown sat on his brow. No armor shone on his back, but behind his quiet gaze burned a fire no one had expected. He moved slowly, always watching, learning. He called himself Caesar's son, and for many, that was enough. Veterans rallied to him, their loyalty reborn in the face of shared memory. Cicero, the orator of fading virtue, saw in him a tool, a way to check Mark Antony's rising influence. He misjudged the boy. Octavian played the Senate and Antony against each other with the calm of a gambler holding every card. He was not loud. He was not rash. He was inevitable. When the second triumvirate formed Octavian, Antony, Lepidus, it was not a pact of brotherhood, but a truce among sharks. Together, they avenged Caesar, crushed the assassins at Philippi, and stained the Republic with lists of the condemned. Prescriptions returned like a fever, names posted, wealth seized, lives ended. Cicero, who had once praised Octavian, found his own name inked in death. His hands were nailed to the very podium from which he once thundered. His tongue, once feared, now fell silent. Rome wept again, not in mourning, but in exhaustion. The city had become accustomed to blood, and in the quiet that followed, Octavian began to unmake his allies. Lepidus faded, cornered and irrelevant. Antony, drawn eastward into Cleopatra's arms, became an easier target. Octavian did not attack him for power. He attacked him for identity. He painted Antony not as a Roman, but as something foreign, something decadent. Cleopatra became the symbol, the Eastern queen, the serpent, the seductress. It did not matter that she was brilliant, eloquent, a ruler in her own right. To Rome, she was other, and to Octavian, that was enough. He presented himself as the son of Rome, sober, dutiful, modest. He wore the cloak of the Republic even as he rewrote its rules. In 31 BCE, the battle at Actium sealed everything. Antony's fleet faltered. Cleopatra fled. Antony followed. Defeat licked at their heels like a rising tide. When Octavian entered Egypt, he did not burn it, he absorbed it. Alexandria, once a jewel of Greek intellect, now shimmered under Roman banners. Antony and Cleopatra died by their own hands, choosing silence over submission. Their son was spared for now. Their legacy was erased, folded into Roman history like ink diluted in wine. Octavian returned to Rome not in triumph, but in suggestion. He spoke not of empire, but of restoration. He refused the crown. He offered to step down. The Senate, perhaps afraid of the silence that might follow his departure, begged him to stay. And so he accepted with humility, with ceremony, with the perfect illusion of reluctance. They named him Augustus, not king, not dictator, but something older, softer, a title that whispered reverence and authority without awakening the ghost of monarchy. And thus began the empire, not with a shout, but with a sigh. Augustus ruled not by force, but by presence. He made himself necessary. Grain flowed, the streets were clean, the fires of civil war cooled to embers. He reformed the tax system, the military, the coinage. He built temples, restored old cults, promoted virtue. Statues of him appeared not as God, but as guardian serene, eternal, a father to a fractured world. The Senate still met, but its debates were echoes. The laws still passed, but their authorship was understood. Augustus had reshaped the state not by destroying it, but by stepping into its empty spaces, filling its voids with his image. The people loved him. They didn't chant his name in frenzy. They didn't need to. He was simply always there, above, around, unspoken, but present, and he gave them peace. The Pax Romana began like a deep breath after drowning. Roads stretched like arms across the provinces. Trade blossomed. Cities rose in Gaul, in Spain, in Africa. Latin became not only a language, but a rhythm. Soldiers guarded the borders, but rarely crossed them. Governors administered, engineers built, poets wrote. Virgil composed the Aeneid, drawing a mythic line from Troy to Rome, wrapping Augustus in the silk of destiny. Ovid sang of love and exile, Horace of leisure and duty. Art flourished, not in rebellion, but in reflection. Rome had become a mirror, polished and grand, but even peace has shadows. The power Augustus held, though gentle, was total. His family became symbols, his heirs chosen and watched. Tragedy touched him often. Illness, exile, betrayal. He outlived many he had once hoped would follow him. And in the quiet moments, perhaps he wondered whether the thing he had built would endure. For beneath the surface, beneath the marble and incense, the question remained, could an empire, born from a republic, ruled by one, survive the one Augustus aged slowly, carefully, his image maintained in sculpture and ceremony? When he died in 14 it was as if the sun had dimmed but not vanished. His successor, Tiberius, was named not with cheers but with resignation. The transition was smooth, orchestrated long before, and so the empire continued. But something had changed. Augustus had been the morning of Rome and its rise, a bridge between what was and what would be. He had mastered the art of appearing modest while holding the world in his hands, and in doing so, he taught every emperor after him what it meant to rule not merely through decree, but through perception. Rome no longer needed to be told. It had learned to believe, in marble, in order, in the fiction of freedom beneath a single voice. The Republic, once a living thing, now rested like an ancestor remembered in speeches, honored in rituals, but no longer breathing. And yet, through all this, the city stood. The hills still held their shape. The Tiber still flowed. And in the morning, when the sun touched the temples and the markets awoke, Rome still felt eternal, even as she changed, even as she mourned, even as she forgot. It began like a long-fought, slow hush falling over the empire, a stillness not born of stagnation, but of a breath finally exhaled after generations of unrest. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, settled upon the world, as if the gods themselves had decided, for a time, to close their eyes. From the hills of Hispania to the fields of Mesopotamia, from the forests of Germania to the sands of Egypt, Rome held her lands in a quiet, firm embrace. There were still skirmishes, uprisings, storms on the edges, but at the heart of it all, there was order. The legions, once instruments of conquest, became guardians of borders. The roads they had carved in war now pulsed with the movement of trade, of pilgrims, of ideas. Merchants crossed the empire under the banner of Roman protection, their carts creaking with spices, silks, scrolls, and stories. Along the Via Appia, olive trees swayed in dusty light, and travelers paused at way stations where the language changed, but the rules remained the same. The empire had become a mirror held up to the world, reflecting its conquered diversity in a single, consistent frame. In cities far from the Tiber, Roman amphitheaters rose like echoes of the Colosseum. Temples bore the faces of Jupiter and Minerva, even where old gods still whispered in local tongues. Latin carved itself into milestones, edicts, prayers, and in every corner of this vast domain, a citizen could look upon a coin and see the face of the emperor serene, unyielding, wrapped in laurel. That face became a mask, not of deception, but of expectation. The emperor was not a man. He was an idea, a continuity, a necessary fiction carried on marble shoulders. After Augustus, emperors came wrapped in his legacy like heirs to a sacred costume. Tiberius, dour and reclusive, ruled not with charisma but calculation. His presence lingered more than it led, a shadow behind the throne, a man whose silences spoke louder than his decrees. Then came Caligula, the golden boy turned madman whose reign began in promise and spiraled into theatrical cruelty. He named his horse consul, built bridges of boats across bays, and demanded worship while the Senate watched in paralyzed disbelief. His death, sudden and brutal, felt less like regicide and more like an exorcism. Yet Rome endured, always, as if the city itself had grown indifferent to the men who claimed to guide it. Claudius, unexpected and awkward, limped into power and surprised them all. Stuttering and bookish, he expanded the empire into Britannia, laying roads and planting legions in cold, fog-wrapped lands where druids whispered to trees and the stars tilted differently. His mind, trained more in history than ambition, brought reforms, organization, a sense of steady hands returning to the wheel. But even he could not escape the tremors beneath the surface. Poisoned, perhaps by his wife Agrippina, he gave way to her son Nero. And with Nero, the golden mask cracked. He fancied himself a poet, a performer, a man touched by divine inspiration. Rome, under his gaze, became a stage. He sang while cities burned. He built palaces like dreams stitched in gold, where ceilings rained perfume and guests dined beneath painted heavens. But beneath the extravagance, the people starved, and the Senate boiled with quiet rage. When rebellion finally stirred, it did not roar. It whispered through the army, through the provinces, through the gates. Nero fled, trembling, and when he died by his own hand, the line of Julius and Augustus was broken. The mask had fallen. What followed was chaos, the year of the four emperors, Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian, each rising, each falling, each grasping for the mask of power, some with bloodied hands, others with trembling hope. The empire reeled, unsure of itself, like a giant who had forgotten how to walk. But from the east came order once more. Vespasian, soldier and builder, father of the Flavian dynasty, pulled Rome back from the brink. He taxed, he restructured, and he began construction on the great amphitheater that would come to symbolize both the glory and the savagery of Roman entertainment, the Colosseum. His sons, Titus and Domitian, followed. Titus, remembered for generosity during plagues and fire, died too soon. Domitian, suspicious and severe, ruled with icy control until daggers returned once again to the palace halls. And still, Rome endured, for the mask had become resilient. It no longer shattered with each face it adorned. It simply changed expressions. Then came Nerva, old and wise, followed by Trajan, the soldier emperor, under whom the empire reached its greatest extent. Rome now stretched from the Atlantic to the Persian Gulf, from the highlands of Scotland to the mountains of Morocco. The sun, they said, never set on Roman land. Trajan built not just with armies, but with stone forums, bridges, markets, aqueducts. His columns spiraled upward in marble narrative, telling tales of conquest like a scroll etched in shadow. And after him came Hadrian, the wall builder, the traveler, the philosopher king. Where Trajan had expanded, Hadrian consolidated. He walked the boundaries. He loved the provinces. He read Greek in quiet gardens. He built not just to show strength, but to express thought. His Pantheon, later rebuilt, crowned the city with a dome like the heavens themselves pressed gently upon the earth. His wall in Britannia snaked across the land like a stern whisper here, and no further, the empire, vast and breathing, began to feel its own edges. And through all this, the people lived, not as conquerors or orators, but as families, merchants, farmers, artisans. They prayed to gods old and new. They listened for imperial announcements as they kneaded bread. They celebrated births, mourned deaths, bargained over olives, and watched their children chase each other in the dust of cities built by emperors they would never meet. And above them all, always, loomed the golden mask, smiling, solemn, serene. It was not a lie. It was a necessity, for the empire could not afford to see the man behind the image. The Pax Romana was not a utopia. It was not peace for all. Rebellion still flared in Judea, in Britain, in Africa. Slaves still suffered. Corruption still grew. But for a time, under stone and law and expectation, the empire held. The rhythm of Roman life became a melody that echoed across centuries. And in that song, the golden mask watched unblinking, unwavering as emperors rose and fell, as temples aged, as coins passed from palm to palm, as time moved forward and history took its breath. It was perhaps inevitable that beneath the perfection of marble arches and the echo of Latin prayers, something wild and cracked would emerge once more. For no empire, no matter how ordered, how architected into straight roads and firm laws, can keep chaos forever chained. And so, the golden mask began to twist. Madness crept not from the edges of the empire, but from its very center, slipping into the corridors of power like ivy through stone. Tiberius, the heir of Augustus, had ruled with a careful hand, though his later years descended into paranoia and retreat, secluding himself on the cliffs of Capri, far from the Senate he no longer trusted, surrounded by whispers and indulgence. But it was his successor, Caligula, who broke the spell of control completely. His real name was Gaius, son of the beloved Germanicus, but as a child he had worn a miniature uniform and tiny boots among the legions, earning him the nickname Caligula Little Boots. At first, the people rejoiced at his ascension. Young, handsome, a blood relative of Augustus, he was seen as a new dawn, but that dawn darkened quickly. Within months, the bright promises gave way to strange decrees, impossible demands, and a spiral of vanity that turned the empire into a grotesque reflection of one man's fractured mind. He declared himself a living god, demanded that statues of Jupiter be refashioned in his own likeness, and built temples not to honor Rome's traditions, but to honor himself. He appointed his horse, Incitatus, as a priest, and threatened to make it a consul. He laughed when people bowed. He cried when they didn't. He drained the treasury not to build, but to dazzle floating palaces, golden feasts, shows of power that humiliated the Senate and glorified the chaos of his own rule. And yet, he was untouchable. For a time, the Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite protectors, watched, and when their patience fractured, they acted. In a corridor, in the shadows, Caligula was cut down. His blood washed the marble clean, but not the stain left upon the empire's soul. Rome gasped, not with sorrow, but relief. Yet the madness did not die with him. It lingered, patient. Claudius, uncle to Caligula, was found trembling behind a curtain, and to everyone's surprise, perhaps even his own, was declared emperor. lame, stuttering. Mocked for his scholarly obsessions, Claudius turned out to be capable, methodical, and oddly shrewd. He expanded into Britannia, reformed the grain supply, and ensured that the wheels of government turned again. But his palace was no refuge. Poison, plots, betrayal all seethed beneath the imperial roof. It was his wife Agrippina who moved most cunningly, ensuring her son from a previous marriage, Nero, would inherit power. When Claudius died, likely by her own hand, the boy emperor rose. Nero began in promise. The philosopher Seneca stood behind him. The early years whispered of balance, art, and reform. But like a quiet wind becoming a storm, Nero's temperament shifted. The Senate became a stage, the empire a mirror. Nero sang to crowds that dared not applaud too loudly or too softly. He raced chariots in private arenas while Rome waited for decrees. He performed on stages in Greece, in Asia Minor, across provinces where emperors had once ruled. Now he entertained. But behind the mask of performance, the machinery of cruelty turned. He killed his mother Agrippina after years of growing suspicion. He ordered her death, then claimed divine justification. He murdered his wife. Then another, his own mentor, Seneca, was commanded to die. And still, Rome tolerated him for a while. But then came the fire. In 64 CE, flames rose and spread through the heart of the city. Wooden tenements collapsed, temples blackened, statues melted. For days, the fire consumed all. People cried out, not only in pain, but in questions. Where was the emperor? Rumors swirled that Nero had watched it all from a private tower, playing his lyre as the city screamed. Whether true or not, it became legend. Nero blamed the Christians, a small, strange sect growing in shadows. He scapegoated them, lit them as torches in his gardens, wrapped them in animal skins for mock hunts, crucified them by the dozen. But the people did not forget the fire. Their anger smoldered like the ashes of their homes. Nero tried to rebuild. He envisioned a golden house, a vast, decadent palace that would stretch across the city's ruins. Domes, lakes, revolving dining rooms. But Rome had grown tired of spectacle. His popularity collapsed. Governors rebelled. The legions withdrew their loyalty. And Nero, once the most powerful man in the world, fled through the night like a hunted animal, alone. Panicked, he stabbed himself in the neck, crying, "What an artist dies in me." Rome heard the news not with mourning, but with a strange kind of silence. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, begun with Augustus, had ended not with glory, but with madness and shame. And then came the void. In a single year, 4 emperors wore the purple. Galba, old and stern, lasted months. Otho, theatrical and eager, fell by his own hand. Vitellius, gluttonous and cruel, ruled in excess. The empire nearly tore itself apart. Legion fought legion. Provinces picked sides. And then came Vespasian, steady, weathered, a soldier more than a statesman. From the east he marched, not for ambition, but for restoration. Rome welcomed him not as a savior, but as a relief. He brought order, reformed the military, imposed taxes, and began construction of the Flavian Amphitheater, the Colosseum atop the site of Nero's ruined palace, as if to erase the memory of tyranny with stone. His sons, Titus and Domitian, inherited the task. Titus, generous and mourned by the people, died young. Domitian ruled longer, darker. He craved titles, built grandly, punished harshly. He became more feared than loved. And when assassins finally reached him, the Senate did not grieve. They issued a damnatio memoriae, a condemnation of memory. His name was scraped from inscriptions, his statues toppled, as if Rome could erase what it no longer wished to remember. But memory is never so easily silenced. The madness of emperors, the erratic pulse of power, had become part of Rome's rhythm. For every golden moment, there was a shadow. For every philosopher on a hill, a tyrant in a palace. And the people, weary, hopeful, enduring, lived between those extremes, watching, waiting, wondering who would wear the laurel next. and whether they would see the face or the mask. South of Rome, beneath the looming shadow of Vesuvius, nestled in the fertile curves of Campania's coastline, there lay a city built not for conquest or politics, but for pleasure. Pompeii. It was a place of villas draped in bougainvillea, of tiled courtyards echoing with laughter, of taverns humming with conversation. Here, the air smelled of figs and olive oil, of bread baking in dome-shaped ovens and the faint salt of the nearby sea. The city pulsed not with imperial ambition, but with the quiet rhythms of Roman life, vendors hawking wares in the forum, children darting through the colonnades, patrons reclining in frescoed tricliniums, sipping wine as they listened to gossip and poetry. Pompeii was not extraordinary in scale. It did not host emperors, nor boast vast legions, but it was Rome, distilled. Its walls bore inscriptions scratched by everyday hands, love notes, insults, business promises. Its mosaics shimmered with scenes of gods and games. Its bathhouses echoed with the mingled voices of senators and slaves alike. Life in Pompeii was not grand, but it was whole. The kind of wholeness that made the city feel eternal, anchored in routine, in sunshine, in the soft illusion that time would always flow the same. But time, like stone, can shatter. On a warm August day in 79 CE, the earth trembled slightly, not enough to frighten, just enough to remind. The mountain had grumbled before. Earthquakes came and went, part of the land's breath. People noted the strange shape of clouds above Vesuvius, like a pine tree stretching upward into the sky, but most went on with their day. Bakers kneaded dough, merchants haggled, lovers whispered beneath grapevines heavy with fruit, and then the heavens split. Ash, not snow, began to fall. Fine at first, like gray powder sifting through the air, then thicker, darker. The sun dimmed, not with dusk, but with death. People looked upward. Some prayed, some ran, some returned home to gather belongings, certain it would pass. It did not pass. Vesuvius erupted with the fury of centuries held silent. A pillar of smoke and ash surged into the sky, climbing more than 20 kilometers high. Pyroclastic flows, waves of searing gas, rock, and death thundered down the mountainside, faster than a horse, hotter than flame. Pompeii had no chance. Roofs collapsed under the weight of ash. Walls cracked. Fires sparked and vanished in the thick black of suffocating air. People died where they stood in doorways, in streets, in beds. Some tried to flee. Others hid in cellars, clutching loved ones. Time stopped, sealed not in memory, but in earth. When the fury subsided, Pompeii was gone, not just ruined, entombed. A city frozen in its final breath. Rome, upon hearing the news, mourned in its own way. Pliny the Elder, the naturalist and admiral, had sailed toward the eruption, drawn by curiosity and duty. He died there, his nephew Pliny the Younger later writing the only surviving eyewitness account, a letter that would echo across millennia. But in the empire's vast machinery, Pompeii was not a capital, it was a footnote. Life moved on. New provinces were subdued, new temples were built, emperors came and went. The city's name slipped into silence, its location forgotten, its streets buried deeper with each passing rain and season. And yet, it waited. Beneath layers of pumice and hardened ash, the city did not rot it preserved. The bread still sat in ovens, carbonized but whole. Tables remained set, paintings held their color, graffiti lingered like echoes. Centuries passed, empires fell, but Pompeii slept, not dead, but dreaming. Then, in 1748, workers digging a canal stumbled upon something strange: walls painted with strange red figures, too vivid to be modern. They had found Herculaneum first, Pompeii's sister city, then Pompeii itself. Excavation began, cautious and crude. As earth was lifted, time came alive. Bodies emerged hollow spaces in the ash, their final postures etched in absence. Plaster casts were poured into those voids, revealing faces twisted in agony, arms thrown over children, fingers still gripping doorframes. But alongside tragedy, there was beauty. Villas with intricate mosaics depicting sea creatures and dancing satyrs, frescoes of Bacchus, Venus, Mercury, erotic art scrawled on brothel walls, everyday life laid bare, unguarded, intimate, immediate. Rome was often remembered through marble and myth, through battles and emperors. But Pompeii revealed another truth, that beneath every empire are people simply living, laughing, fearing, bathing, loving. Their stories were not in scrolls, but in sandals left by the door, in inked names on a wine jug, in a dog curled forever in sleep by a threshold. Historians studied the ruins. Artists wept among the frescoes. Tourists walked the stone streets, stepping where Roman feet had stepped 2,000 years before. And as the modern world swirled with its own chaos, Pompeii remained not only as a ruin, but as a mirror. It showed what an ordinary day looks like before disaster, what a city feels like just before silence. And in that mirror, many saw themselves. The empire had not fallen yet. Rome's power still surged after Pompeii, but the eruption had left a message, not in fire, but in stone, that even marble can be buried, that the gods, when they whisper through the earth, are not always kind, that empires, no matter how vast, are still made of people fragile, fleeting, full of noise and love and fear. In the shadow of Vesuvius, that truth hardened into ash, and Rome, even at its zenith, learned that no peace is permanent, no pleasure eternal, and the mountain, always quiet afterward, never forgot how to speak. As the dust of Pompeii settled into legend and memory, the empire turned its gaze outward once more, not in grief, but in resolve. The machinery of Rome was never idle. Where disaster whispered, ambition roared. And at the helm of this new momentum stood Trajan, the soldier emperor, the first to be born not in Italy, but in the provinces in the warm hills of Hispania. His ascent was not bred in palaces, but earned on battlefields. He wore his authority like a seasoned cuirass, practical, worn, unpretentious. When the Senate named him Optimus Princeps, the best of princes, it was not merely flattery, but a reflection of what he had become. Under his reign, the empire would reach its greatest geographical breadth, its farthest stretch into the unknown. Trajan saw not limits, but invitations. Beyond the familiar contours of the Danube, in the rugged lands of Dacia, modern-day Romania, he saw a land rich in gold, resistant in spirit. It was not enough to govern what Rome already held. He longed to push the frontier, to draw new lines on maps and carve his name into the mountains. The Dacians, fierce and proud, had troubled Rome for decades. Their king, Decebalus, was not a barbarian in rags, but a shrewd strategist, a negotiator, a monarch who knew how to balance war and diplomacy. But Trajan did not come to negotiate. He came to conquer. 2 long campaigns ensued. Bridges were built across the Danube, fortresses razed, legions marched through valleys red with autumn and iron. It was not easy. Dacian resistance was brutal, but Trajan was relentless. Eventually, Decebalus fell not in surrender, but in suicide, and with him, Dacia became Roman. The spoils of that victory poured into the capital. Gold flowed like a river, and with it, Trajan built, not temples to gods, but monuments to memory. His form rose like a marble theater of conquest, adorned with libraries, markets, and the colossal Basilica Ulpia, and towering above it all, the column of Trajan, a spiral of sculpted stone, unwinding like a scroll, depicting the Dacian wars in exquisite, unbroken narrative. Even now, it tells its story in silence, a chronicle of power told not with words, but with shadows. But Trajan's ambition didn't stop at Dacia. He looked east, toward Parthia, the old nemesis. In Mesopotamia, he led his legions into cities whose names had echoed in the tales of Alexander Babylon, Ctesiphon, Susa. For a moment, Rome held both ends of the world in her hands, but the grasp was too wide. The provinces, stretched thin, began to whisper with unease. Revolt stirred. The tide of victory ebbed. And in this growing tension, Trajan's health faltered. He died in Cilicia, far from Rome. His ashes returned in a golden urn to rest beneath his column. It was Hadrian, his adopted heir, who inherited not just the empire, but the burden of its boundaries. Where Trajan had extended, Hadrian retracted. He was not a conqueror, he was a consolidator, a philosopher in a general's cloak. He traveled more than he ruled from Rome, walking the roads of the empire as if tracing the lines of a living body. He visited the provinces, not to demand tribute, but to understand them, their cultures, their gods, their tensions. In Greece, he worshipped at ancient temples. In Egypt, he sailed the Nile. In Asia Minor, he built cities. But it was in the windswept lands of Britannia that he made his most enduring mark. There, the frontier was not a line, but a blur between Rome and the unknown, between empire and emptiness. The tribes of the North Wild, elusive, refused the embrace of Roman order. So Hadrian drew a line not just in policy, but in stone, a wall, stretching over 70 miles across the island's neck, from sea to sea. Hadrian's wall was both barrier and symbol. Its stones were laid not only with mortar, but with message: here ends Rome. Beyond this wall, there's wilderness. Behind it, civilization. The soldiers who manned its forts came from all corners of the empire: Syria, Gaul, Africa, cooking their stews, singing old songs, writing graffiti in Latin, and longing in local tongues. They lived in the liminal space between worlds, under skies thick with the northern mist, and as the wind howled through the heather, they stood watch not for glory, but for the quiet duty of holding a line. Hadrian did not seek to rule the whole world. He sought to hold what had been won. His rule was marked by architecture, philosophy, restraint. He banned circumcision in Judea, sparking a violent rebellion led by Bar Kokhba, a revolt so fierce it nearly consumed the province. Rome crushed it, as she always did, but at great cost, entire towns vanished. The name Judea was erased, replaced with Syria Palestina. The temple in Jerusalem, long destroyed, was replaced by Roman structures. The old gods of the Hebrews, suppressed. It was a victory written in erasure, and yet, for all his power, Hadrian was a man of deep sorrow. His love for Antinous, the young Bithynian boy who drowned in the Nile, haunted him. He deified the youth, built temples in his name, minted coins with his face, not as a son, not as a prince, but as a god. The empire, used to deifying emperors, now whispered of a mortal boy who had become divine through grief. Hadrian aged with increasing isolation. His health deteriorated. He wandered through his villa in Tibur, a sprawling, dreamlike complex of pools, colonnades, and memories. There he sculpted a world of his own, drawn from the lands he had walked, the cities he had touched. He left behind no children, no dynasty, only stone and sorrow. When he died, the empire did not rejoice. It reflected, and in that reflection, Rome saw two faces: Trajan's, lined with ambition, and Hadrian's, creased with contemplation. One had dreamed of a Rome that swallowed the world. The other had drawn a circle around what could be kept. And in the quiet between those visions, the empire held its breath. For now, the roads still bustled, the baths still steamed, the forum still echoed with commerce and complaint, the legions still stood watch, and the walls, both visible and unseen, still marked where Rome ended, and everything else began. In the waning golden light of the 2nd century, as the empire still basked in the architectural grandeur and administrative order left behind by emperors who built like gods and ruled like engineers, there came a ruler whose strength was not in stone or conquest, but in thought. Marcus Aurelius, last of the so-called 5 good emperors, wore the purple robe not with the ambition of expansion, nor the thirst of vanity, but with the weary wisdom of a man who had read too deeply into the nature of fate. He did not seek the throne, but when it came to him, he accepted it with the quiet resignation of a philosopher pressed into service. His meditations, composed in the solitude of campaigns and the hush of late-night vigils, were not proclamations, but private reflections, notes to himself, reminders that even emperors must bow to the laws of nature, to loss, to time. He spoke not of ruling the world, but of ruling the self, to live in harmony with reason, to embrace hardship as a teacher, to meet death without flinching. And yet, as much as he longed for the serenity of the Stoa, the world he inherited refused peace. The northern frontiers, especially along the Danube, stirred with tribes that refused the Roman grasp. The Marcomanni, the Quadi, others unnamed in Roman maps, pushed and probed, sensing the edges of imperial fatigue, and so Marcus left Rome, donned his armor, and led his legions into mud and cold, writing wisdom on parchment with one hand, while holding the sword with the other. The wars were long, not glamorous. They were fought not in grand fields, but in forests soaked with mist and blood, against foes who vanished like smoke and struck like hail. Rome prevailed, as she always had, but the cost was mounting. Then came a blow no sword could parry. In the year 165, during the return of legions from the east, a sickness arrived. It moved slowly at first, then swiftly a fever, a rash, coughing, pain, death. The Antonine Plague, as it would later be named, tore through the empire like fire through dry grass. It killed the old, the young, the strong. In cities, the baths fell silent, the markets thinned, the temples filled with prayers unanswered. Some whispered it was divine punishment. Others saw in it the randomness of life laid bare. Entire legions were weakened. Whole provinces lost their strength. In Rome, the funeral pyres burned day and night, their smoke trailing into a sky that no longer answered. Marcus did not flee. He did not hide. He governed through the storm, issuing edicts, maintaining grain supplies, caring for orphans, watching the numbers dwindle. The plague became not just a crisis, but a mirror revealing what Rome had become. So vast, so interconnected, that no corner could escape the breath of death. The roads that had once carried conquest and culture now carried contagion, and yet, even in despair, life persisted. The empire did not fall. It stumbled, but it stood. Marcus returned to the front, ever vigilant, ever writing. His son, Commodus, however, was not cut from the same cloth. Where Marcus read philosophy, Commodus admired gladiators. Where his father governed with principle, he sought adoration. Upon Marcus's death in 180, Commodus inherited the empire not as a steward, but as a performer. He believed himself a new Hercules, parading in lion skins, descending into the arena to fight beasts and men, not as emperor, but as spectacle. The Senate, already weakened, recoiled. The people, distracted by games and grain, watched as power became theater. Corruption festered, plots abounded. Assassination finally came, not from the shadows, but from within the palace by those who had once cheered him. With Commodus's death, the old stability of succession shattered. What followed was not a passing of torches, but a scramble for fire, the year of the 5 emperors. A name too orderly for the chaos it describes unfolded with generals rising in different provinces, each declared emperor by their own legions. Civil war erupted. Legions fought legions. Cities chose sides. Blood-soaked soil that had once only known the echo of sandals and prayer. Septimius Severus emerged from the struggle, another outsider from Africa, a soldier, shrewd and relentless. He re-centralized authority, increased the army's pay, and made clear that the emperor's power came not from senatorial approval, but from military might. Rome's identity shifted further. No longer the republic's husk wrapped in imperial silk, but now openly a military monarchy ruled not by law, but by loyalty. He died on campaign in Britannia, commanding his sons to enrich the soldiers and despise all others. Those sons, Caracalla and Geta, proved his words too true. Caracalla murdered his brother, then granted citizenship to all free men in the empire, not out of benevolence, but to expand the tax base. His rule was harsh, his end violent, and Rome watched as once again, the purple was passed not through legacy, but through blood. Meanwhile, the plague returned. New diseases swept through the cities, the economy strained, the borders cracked. In the east, the Parthians gave way to the Sassanid Persians, fiercer, more ambitious. In the west, the Rhine and Danube frontiers buckled under waves of incursions. The 3rd century dawned not with glory, but with a slow unraveling. Emperors rose and fell in months. Some reigned only in name, never reaching Rome before being cut down. The empire fractured, Gaul broke away, Palmyra declared independence. It seemed the great machine was rusting, and yet, again, it did not fall. It adapted. New emperors arose who did not wait for senatorial approval. They took power with swords and grit. Among them, Aurelian, a general who reconquered breakaway provinces, fortified Rome with new walls, restored order, then Diocletian, who reorganized the empire entirely, creating the Tetrarchy, a rule of 4 to ease the burden of governance. He built palaces, restructured the military, persecuted Christians in a last attempt to restore the old gods. He saw clearly what many denied, that Rome could not remain what it had been. It had to evolve or vanish. And so, beneath the weight of plague, rebellion, inflation, and fatigue, the empire shifted not outward, but inward. The golden peace of Marcus had faded, but in its place, a strange resilience emerged. A Rome no longer romantic, but real, hardened, haunted, still alive. The empire, though wounded, continued to breathe its breath, now shallow, but defiant. By the dawn of the 4th century, Rome was no longer a single voice echoed through marble halls, but a fractured symphony played across shifting capitals, marching camps, and provincial courts. The idea of Rome, so long centered in one eternal city, had begun to wander, carried by generals, emperors, and the unrelenting wind of necessity. The empire, stretched across continents, spoke with many mouths and obeyed many hands. The borders were under siege not just from foreign tribes, but from time itself, erosion from within, pressure from without. Where once the Senate had issued decrees with stoic clarity, now emperors wore the purple for weeks, sometimes only days, their names etched into coinage that barely circulated before being melted down and restamped with the face of a new ruler. Civil war had become a rhythm, and loyalty, a currency. The legions no longer pledged themselves to the Senate or even to Rome, but to men ambitious, desperate, charismatic, who promised them gold, land, or vengeance. Cities fell not to invaders, but to their own defenders turning coats. And yet, amid this spiraling disunity, came a figure who would bind the empire once more, though not in the old ways. Constantine, tall, calculating, patient, did not rise in a blaze of revolution, but through a series of measured steps, each one more irreversible than the last. He was the son of a Caesar, reared in courts where ambition dripped like honey and betrayal whispered through velvet curtains. When his father died, Constantine was declared emperor by his troops, not in Rome, but in far-off Eboracum, modern-day York. From that northern edge, he would march southward, not just across the empire, but into history. His greatest rival was Maxentius, who ruled from Rome with pomp but little legitimacy. Their final confrontation came at the Milvian Bridge. The night before the battle, Constantine saw a vision, a cross of light in the sky, and the words, "In hoc signo vinces, in this sign, conquer." The next morning, his soldiers painted the Chi Rho on their shields, a Christian symbol where once the eagles of Jupiter had reigned. Victory followed. Maxentius drowned in the Tiber, and Constantine entered the city not just as a victor, but as something more, a man who claimed both divine favor and imperial right. The world had shifted. Rome, still draped in statues of its pagan gods, now stood beneath a banner marked with a carpenter's son. Constantine did not immediately outlaw the old religions. He was shrewd, pragmatic, but he favored the Christians. He returned their confiscated property, gave bishops political weight, and convened the Council of Nicaea to settle theological rifts not as priest, but as emperor. In his hands, the cross and the crown became one. The city of Rome, symbolic but strained, was no longer the heart. Constantine looked east, toward Byzantium, a small Greek city by the Bosporus. There, he saw potential, a place at the crossroads of trade, protected by water, near the troubled eastern frontier. He rebuilt it, grandly, lavishly, and he named it Constantinople, the city of Constantine. It would become his true capital and the beginning of a new Rome. Meanwhile, the old world buckled under new pressures. The Germanic tribes, long dancing at the empire's edges, pressed harder. The Goths, Vandals, Franks, and Saxons' names that once sounded distant were now daily threats. Some came as raiders, others as refugees, fleeing the storm clouds gathering far to the east, where a new force the Huns stirred like thunder. In response, Rome reshaped itself again. The empire split, officially now east and west. 2 emperors, 2 courts, 2 Romes. One spoke Greek, the other Latin. One dreamed of trade and stability, the other fought for survival. The Western Empire, poor in resources, more exposed to frontier chaos, grew fragile. Emperors came and went, some mere children, others puppets. Real power lay with generals like Stilicho, Aetius, men who knew the sword better than the law. In 410, the unthinkable happened. Alaric, king of the Visigoths, sacked Rome. It had stood unbroken for 800 years, but now it burned. The shock rippled across the world. Saint Jerome, upon hearing the news, wrote in despair, "If Rome can perish, what can be safe?" But Rome did not die that day. It trembled, it cried out, and then it endured. The Senate still met, the people still prayed, but something had broken, not a wall, but a sense of eternity. Over the next decades, the West weakened. The Vandals crossed into Africa, seizing Carthage, Rome's old rival, and turning it into their stronghold. They built fleets, raided the coasts, even sailed up the Tiber. In 455, they sacked the city again. This time, the damage was deeper. The empire that had once dictated the world now begged for mercy from those it had once called barbarian. And yet, the East Constantinople thrived. Its walls stood firm, its coffers were full, its court, refined and deadly, played politics like chess. While Rome starved, Constantinople dined. While the West burned, the East wrote laws, minted coins, debated theology in candlelit halls. In 476, the Western Roman Empire fell in form, if not completely in function. The child emperor Romulus Augustulus was deposed by Odoacer, a Germanic general. No legions marched in protest, no senators wept. The news arrived with a sigh, not a scream. The crown was sent east, to Constantinople, as if to say, "Here, you keep it." The eternal city remained, but as a relic, a memory. Yet memories have power. Even as the political heart shifted east, the idea of Rome continued to haunt Europe. The Church, rising in influence, claimed the mantle of Roman authority through the papacy. The Bishop of Rome, now called the Pope, wielded not armies, but absolution. And in time, new emperors would rise in the West. Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Emperors, each draping themselves in borrowed glory, each insisting that Rome lived on through them. Meanwhile, in the East, the Byzantine Empire, as we call it now, carried the flame. Emperors like Justinian would try to reclaim the old lands, waging war in Italy, building the Hagia Sophia, codifying Roman law. But the world had changed. The empire was no longer Roman in tongue or spirit. It was something new, Christian, Greek, imperial, yet it kept the dream alive. And through all this, the memory of a unified empire, of a Rome that once ruled sea to sea, endured like a shadow cast by a star long dead. The crown had fractured, yes, but its pieces glinted still, in crowns worn by kings, in laws spoken in Latin, in ruins that whispered stories under vines and dust. Rome, divided, scattered, ghost-like, still lived in language, in roads, in churches, in calendars. And every time a bell tolled in a European village, every time a building echoed with an arch, every time a legal code began with civitas, the fractured crown shimmered once more, reminding the world of what had been and what still lingered, hidden in the bones of time. When the legions first bore the eagle into battle, it was Jupiter they called upon, father of gods, lord of lightning, the great protector of Rome. Temples rose to him in gleaming white marble. Incense burned in his honor. Augurs read the flights of birds in his name. Mars, god of war, stood beside him. Venus, goddess of love and lineage, whispered through the myths that justified Rome's destiny. The pantheon was not merely a collection of deities, it was a structure of state, a mirror of order. But as centuries passed, as borders expanded, and as citizens of conquered lands brought with them their gods, their rituals, their doubts, Rome began to shift. Beneath the official rites, new voices stirred quieter, stranger, sometimes secret. Mithras, worshipped in caverns by soldiers. Isis, mother goddess from Egypt, beloved by women and slaves. And then came the Christians, not with swords or temples, but with stories. Stories of a man who healed, who forgave, who suffered, who died, and returned. At first, they were little more than a rumor, a sect in the back alleys of Judea. But Rome had learned to fear whispers. By the time Nero used them as scapegoats for the Great Fire, they had already spread beyond Jerusalem. They met in homes, in catacombs, sharing bread, singing in low voices. They refused to worship the emperor. They claimed a kingdom not of this world. And so they were hunted, martyred, burned, fed to beasts. Yet the more they died, the more they multiplied. Blood did not quench their faith. It baptized it. By the 3rd century, Christians were everywhere: senators' wives, scribes, soldiers, children. They had no temples, but they had conviction. No armies, but they had endurance. Rome cracked down again and again. From Decius to Diocletian, edicts were issued, churches destroyed, scriptures burned. But the fire spread, not dimmed. It was into this world that Constantine was born, a world where the old gods still held court in marble. But their voices grew distant. Constantine had seen both sides. His mother, Helena, was a Christian. His court, cautious and split. But Constantine was not driven by belief alone. He was a strategist. He saw that Christianity offered something Rome could no longer find in Jupiter's thunder: unity. Not just of faith, but of purpose. It gave the people an identity that transcended tribe, province, class, and it was growing stronger every year. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE was not merely military, it was symbolic. That night before, when he looked up and saw the cross in the sky, real or imagined, it changed history. When he painted the symbol on his soldiers' shields, it was not just protection, it was alignment. And when he won, and entered Rome not as a destroyer but as a deliverer, he brought with him a new standard. The Edict of Milan followed in 313 CE. Constantine and Licinius, co-rulers at the time, proclaimed religious tolerance throughout the empire. Christians emerged from the shadows. Bishops stepped into public view. Churches began to rise, not hidden in basements, but in sunlight. Yet Constantine was careful. He did not dismantle the old gods. He allowed temples to stand. He bore the title Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of the traditional Roman religion. His coins bore pagan imagery for years after his conversion. He understood that empires, like ships, could not turn too quickly, but he leaned, quietly and steadily, toward the new faith. His mother Helena journeyed to the Holy Land, where she claimed to have found the true cross. Shrines were built, pilgrimages began. The sacred was no longer something inherited. It was sought, but as Christianity grew, it fractured. Questions of theology emerged. Was Christ divine or human? Was the Father greater than the Son? The bishops argued, councils debated, schisms threatened. Constantine saw the danger and acted. In 325 CE, he summoned bishops from across the empire to Nicaea, a city in Asia Minor, to settle the matter. The Council of Nicaea was not a spiritual retreat, it was a political necessity. The Nicene Creed was born a statement of faith, of unity, of control. Constantine presided not as a theologian, but as an emperor wielding belief like another kind of sword. And so Christianity began its transformation from persecuted sect to imperial institution. Bishops gained influence, churches gained wealth, pagan temples were repurposed, slowly, subtly. The process was not immediate. It took generations, but the direction was set. Constantine built a new capital, not in Rome, but in Byzantium. He called it Nova Roma at first, then Constantinople. There, in the east, he could start anew, free from the Senate's weight, from old traditions, from the decaying rituals of the past. He filled the city with grandeur walls, forums, churches, palaces. It gleamed beside the Bosporus like a pearl caught between continents. When he died in 337 CE, Constantine was baptized on his deathbed, not an uncommon practice then, but still symbolic. He had lived as a bridge between pagan and Christian, between old and new, between empire and church. His legacy was complex. He didn't end the empire's troubles. In fact, many would follow, but he changed its soul. After him, no emperor could rule without reckoning with the church. The bishops would become kingmakers. The faith, once nailed to a cross outside Jerusalem, now sat on thrones. And Rome, the eternal, adaptable, shifting Rome had once again remade itself. Not in marble this time, but in belief. Yet belief, like power, is never without its shadows. The faith that had once spoken of love and humility began to police itself. Heresies were hunted: Arianism, Donatism, Pelagianism, each deviation named, debated, condemned. Councils became battlegrounds. Emperors became enforcers. The cross, once a symbol of suffering, now stood upon shields and battle standards. Christianity became imperial, and in becoming imperial, it inherited Rome's old contradictions. But it also gave the empire something Rome had never fully possessed: a story that transcended city and soil. A story that could survive the fall of walls, that could pass from Latin to Greek to Gothic to Slavic. Constantine had chosen well, or perhaps history had chosen him. Either way, the crossroads had been crossed. The gods of Olympus faded, their temples fell into disuse, their statues cracked by time, but their legacy lingered in columns, in language, in the bones of cities. And over them, churches rose, basilicas, cathedrals, mosaics shimmering with gold leaf and blue glass, choirs where once oracles had spoken, incense rising again not to Jupiter, but to Christ. The empire was no longer just a political body, it was spiritual now, eternal in a different way. And even as borders frayed, as barbarians circled, as the western provinces began to crumble, the faith spread uncloaked in robes, carried in song, etched into the hearts of peoples Rome had never conquered by force. The cross had come to rule. The wind at the edges of the empire began to change. It was not sudden, not like the trumpet of war, or the clap of an invading army's boots upon stone. It was gradual, like the long sigh of a great forest before the storm arrives. In the northern provinces, where once Roman roads gleamed with discipline, and Latin rang from amphitheaters carved into distant hills, there now rose murmurs in a dozen dialects, murmurs of movement, murmurs of hunger, murmurs of tribes that once watched Rome from the trees and now began to gather. The Goths, pressed from behind by the terrifying speed and savagery of the Huns, asked for shelter within Rome's borders, not with swords, but with pleading. In 376 CE, the Emperor Valens allowed them to settle in the Balkans, thinking perhaps they would be manageable. But Rome, bloated and brittle, could not feed them. Officials extorted them, starved them, humiliated them. What entered as a migration soon became a rebellion. In 378, at the Battle of Adrianople, the empire suffered a blow it had not known in centuries. The Eastern Emperor himself rode into battle Valens, proud, dismissive, and never returned. The Gothic cavalry trampled the legions, the field littered with imperial armor and imperial arrogance. For the first time in memory, Rome had not merely lost a battle, it had lost a sense of invincibility. The West trembled. Emperors were appointed and deposed like candles blown out in succession. One moment, Magnus Maximus; the next, Valentinian; then Eugenius; then Theodosius, the last to rule both halves of the empire. After him, the line split permanently. East and West, Constantinople and Ravenna. One would last 1,000 more years. The other had already begun to die. In the East, Rome became Byzantium, smooth, resilient, complex, a serpent coiled around bureaucracy and faith. In the West, Rome remained Rome, proud, decaying, increasingly ceremonial. The emperors ruled less like lords and more like actors in a play whose audience had begun to leave. The real power lay in generals: Stilicho, Aetius, Ricimer. They pulled the strings, led the armies, balanced loyalties like a juggler with knives, but they too, were fragile. Rome could not afford to keep them all happy. Assassinations followed victories, trust eroded, and the walls, the literal ones, the metaphoric ones, began to crack. Then came Alaric, a Gothic chieftain turned Roman general turned enemy. He had once fought for the empire, had once sworn to protect it, but broken promises, unpaid troops, and political insult had turned him. He marched south, he laid siege, and in 410 CE, Rome, the eternal, the unconquered, fell to a foreign army. The gates were opened by slaves, no great battle, just a shuddering collapse of order. For 3 days, the city was plundered, churches spared, temples desecrated, households terrified. It was not the brutality of Carthage, nor the obliteration of Troy, it was worse. It was the memory of invincibility, shattered. The Visigoths left, carrying with them gold, hostages, and Rome's pride. Across the provinces, people asked, if Rome can fall, what can stand? Saint Jerome wept in his monastery. Augustine wrote of heavenly cities to make sense of collapsing earthly ones. The empire continued, but it limped. Emperors were crowned by generals, deposed by rivals, assassinated by courtiers. The Vandals crossed into Africa, seizing Carthage in 403, the breadbasket of Rome. From there, they launched fleets, raiding Sicily, Corsica, even the coast of Italy. In 455, they sacked Rome again, more thorough, more merciless. The people hid in churches. The wealth of centuries was packed into ships and vanished. And still, the emperors persisted. Puppets, shadows, names lost in the smoke. Odoacer, a Germanic general, rose not as a conqueror but as a custodian. In 476, when Romulus Augustulus, a boy, barely a figurehead, was deposed, no legions rose to avenge him, no orators demanded justice. Rome had exhausted its outrage. The title of emperor in the West was abolished. The imperial insignia sent to Constantinople, the Senate remained, but with no teeth. Rome had become a relic of itself, a city of bishops and memories. The Western Roman Empire had fallen. But what does it mean for something to fall? Did it crash, like a statue toppling, or did it simply dissolve, like mist beneath the rising sun? In truth, Rome faded. It receded. It became something softer, stranger, a dream clutched by barbarians who wore togas and called themselves patricians, by popes who crowned kings with imperial rhetoric, by monks who copied Virgil by candlelight. The Ostrogoths ruled Italy next. Then the Byzantines reclaimed it briefly. Then the Lombards came. Each new ruler built upon Roman roads, lived in Roman villas, tried to speak Roman law. They could not replace Rome, but they carried its fragments. The church, too, grew no longer persecuted, but powerful. The Pope, once just another bishop, became the voice of moral authority. The basilicas rose as the old temples crumbled, crosses where once stood statues of Mars, Latin hymns in place of triumphal chants, and in the east, Constantinople endured. Justinian, in the 6th century, sought to revive the old empire. He reconquered parts of Italy, codified Roman law into the Corpus Juris Civilis, a legal legacy that would shape Europe for a millennium. He built Hagia Sophia, a cathedral that shimmered like a second pantheon, drenched in light and mosaic. But even Byzantium could not escape time. Plagues ravaged its streets. Borders shrank. Enemies multiplied. Yet through it all, the dream of Rome never died. It transformed. In the West, Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Romans in 800, though his court spoke German and prayed in Latin. The Holy Roman Empire claimed the name, if not the blood. Scholars debated Roman law. Architects mimicked Roman arches. Cities called themselves the New Rome. Even as the centuries passed, the memory lingered in roads still used, in languages still spoken, in ideals of law, citizenship, empire. And what of Rome itself? The city lived, wounded, but breathing. Cows grazed in its abandoned forums. Pilgrims knelt where Caesars once paraded. Columns stood amid rubble. The Colosseum filled with silence. Yet somehow, through plunder and plague, it remained. A palimpsest. A a city written over, again and again, but never erased. Rome had once ruled with the legions, now it ruled with echoes, and echoes are hard to kill. The barbarians did not destroy Rome, they became it. In sword and in scripture, in village and in vision, they carried forward pieces of a shattered whole. What they could not rebuild, they remembered. What they could not remember, they reinvented. And the twilight of the empire, far from being an end, was a transformation from power to influence, from empire to idea. For Rome, even broken, had planted itself too deeply to be dug out. It lived not in marble, but in the marrow, in law, in faith, in architecture, in ambition, in every city that built straight roads, in every state that crowned its rulers, in every child who studied Latin or dreamed of glory. The barbarians had come, the crown had fallen, the banners had burned, but the dream, impossibly, endured. Time does not destroy Rome, it simply rearranges her. In the stillness of the 21st century, beneath the buzz of tourists and the flutter of pigeons circling the ruins, she remains, not an empire, not in legions, not in gold or decree, but in stone and shadow, in language and law, in dream and dust. The Roman Forum now lies open to the sky, its broken columns pointing like withered fingers toward the heavens they once defied. The voices that once thundered through its basilicas have faded, replaced by the soft murmur of guides and the occasional rustle of wind through ancient leaves. The Colosseum stands like a memory that refuses to be buried, its arches gaping like half-remembered prayers, its floor long gone, exposing the labyrinth beneath where gladiators waited, where animals prowled, where blood and sand met in rituals of spectacle. Tourists stand there now, cameras in hand, unaware that their very presence, their curiosity, is the latest chapter in Rome's long, unending story. The city breathes differently now. Its heartbeat is slower, softer, but it still pulses in the uneven cobblestones of the Via Appia, in the fountains of Piazza Navona, in the domes of churches that were once pagan temples, their marble repurposed, their altars reclaimed. Rome has never feared reinvention. She welcomes it, she absorbs, she endures. Her gods have changed, her rulers replaced, her walls broken and rebuilt, yet always she remains. Even when she seemed lost, buried beneath ash or looted by fire, she waited, quietly, patiently, like a lion asleep in the shade. Her tongue lives on in every Romance language, in the lilting syllables of Italian, the cadence of French, the flourish of Spanish, the strength of Portuguese, the mystery of Romanian. Her laws form the backbone of civil codes from Paris to Brasilia. Her roads, though worn, still guide. Her aqueducts, though dry, still arch proudly over the fields. Her architecture whispers into every dome, every arch, every column raised in her image. But more than this, more than stone or system, Rome survives in the way we imagine ourselves. She taught the world how to build permanence from impermanence, how to wield power not just through conquest, but through culture. The Senate, long defunct, lives on as a symbol of debate, of deliberation. The Republic, though lost, continues as an aspiration reborn in parliaments and constitutions. The Empire, though broken, remains a caution and a dream. In every great city, Rome waits. In Washington's white columns, in London's courts, in the boulevards of Paris, in the capital cities of Africa and South America. Her shadow moves silently, dignified. Even in decline, she taught how to fall with grace, how to lose without vanishing. And in that, perhaps, lies her greatest lesson: endurance. She was never perfect. She was brutal, corrupt, often cruel. She enslaved, she conquered, she crucified, but she also debated, built, wrote, dreamed. She embraced contradiction. She knew both Cicero and Caligula, both Augustus and Nero, both stoicism and excess. She wore every mask and bore every scar. And yet, through all of it, she became a mirror in which humanity still sees itself. To study Rome is to study the layers of civilization not as they were, but as they became, layer upon layer. Etruscan tombs, Republican marble, imperial palaces, Christian basilicas, medieval fortresses, Renaissance masterpieces, Baroque extravagance, fascist geometry, modern sprawl. No city in the world contains so many echoes, each era built atop the bones of the last, never quite erasing, never quite forgetting. And so, she stands today, not eternal in power, but in presence. Tourists walk her streets, unaware they trace the paths of processions that once honored Jupiter, then Christ, then emperors, then generals, then popes. School children play in courtyards where philosophers once argued over fate and virtue. Lovers kiss on bridges that once carried legions, and in quiet churches, tucked between restaurants and ruins, flickering candles illuminate faces painted centuries ago, saints who wear togas, martyrs who once prayed in the catacombs that still snake beneath the earth. Beneath it all, the city waits. Her hills hold memories older than language. Her stones have heard every language rise and fall. Her sky has watched men dream of ruling the world and fall to their knees in prayer. Rome does not need to be reborn. She never truly died. Her death was written many times by historians, by generals, by poets, but none of them buried her, because she was never only a city, she was a symbol, an inheritance, a question, a promise. She is the whisper in every grand ambition, the shadow in every collapse, the ghost that walks beside every empire that rises. And now, as the world changes once again, as new powers rise and old ones tremble, as borders shift and ideologies collide, Rome remains not to rule, not to judge, but to remind. That greatness is not without cost. That power is always temporary. That what we build, we must one day protect, then relinquish. That the glory of a people lies not in how long they last, but in what they leave behind. Rome left behind no final answer, only a long, winding echo stretching through time, through silence, through story. And in that echo, perhaps, we hear something more than history. Perhaps, in the ruins and the relics, in the forgotten laws and the lingering songs, we hear ourselves, the part of us that builds, the part that dreams, the part that falls, and then impossibly, defiantly rises again.